She was found in a wedding gown on the side of a highway in the middle of a blizzard, barefoot, alone, and worth $4 billion. He was a single father with a broken heater and a daughter who cried herself to sleep. They had nothing in common. They had no reason to trust each other. And yet the night Grayson Reed pulled his truck onto that shoulder and stepped into the snow, two lives that had been quietly falling apart began, without either of them knowing it, to find their way back together. If this is your first time here, hit like, and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The school meeting had gone exactly as badly as Grayson Reed had expected. He sat in the parking lot of Greenwich Elementary for a few minutes after it ended, engine running, heater blasting lukewarm air that did almost nothing against the cold, hand still gripping the steering wheel like he was trying to wring something out of it. The fluorescent lights of the building threw pale squares across the snow-covered asphalt. Most of the other parents had already gone. Mrs. Hartley, Sophie's third-grade teacher, was a kind woman who had clearly rehearsed what she was going to say before he arrived. She used phrases like difficulty with peer engagement and trouble processing classroom transitions, and we think it might be worth exploring some additional support. She had a folder. There were printed handouts. She slid a brochure across the table at one point, something about a child behavioral specialist 2 towns over. And Grayson had taken it and folded it in half and put it in his jacket pocket because he didn't know what else to do with it. "She's a smart girl," Mrs. Hartley had said, and she meant it, which was the part that made it harder. "She's one of the sharpest kids I've had in years. She has a hard time letting other people in." He'd driven home the long way without deciding to, through the older part of town where the streetlights were farther apart, and the houses sat back from the road behind bare, winter-stripped trees. He wasn't avoiding anything in particular. He just wasn't ready to walk into a quiet house and look at Sophie sleeping and feel whatever it was he was going to feel. His daughter was 8 years old, and she had a hard time letting other people in. He knew where that came from. He didn't need a brochure to explain it. The snow had been coming down steadily since late afternoon, but it picked up around 9, the kind of heavy, purposeful snowfall that fills the air so completely you stop being able to tell the distance between things. The highway heading north out of Greenwich was empty. His headlights punched about 30 feet ahead of him, and beyond that was just white and dark in alternating layers. He almost missed her. What caught his eye first was the wheelchair. It was stopped at an odd angle near the shoulder, one wheel half off the pavement onto the gravel, and it caught his headlights in a way that made it look almost luminescent for a second, chrome and white against the gray-dark snowfall. His brain didn't immediately process what he was seeing. He thought at first it was a piece of equipment that had fallen from a vehicle, a dolly or a pushcart, something industrial. Then he saw the person beside it. He hit the brakes. The truck slid a little before catching traction. He pulled as far onto the shoulder as he could and left the hazard lights on and got out. And the cold hit him so hard and sudden it actually made him flinch. The wind had teeth out here away from the trees. The snow was coming sideways. She was on her hands and knees in the snow beside the wheelchair. She was wearing a wedding dress. It had been, once, a spectacular thing. Even now, soaked through and gray at the hem and torn along the left side from the shoulder to the rib cage, you could see what it had been. Layers of what might have been silk organza, a fitted bodice, the kind of dress that cost more than his truck and possibly more than his house. She had no coat. She had no shoes. Her hands were pressed flat against the snow-covered asphalt, and she was trying to push herself forward, trying to move toward the wheelchair, and she couldn't quite reach it. Grayson covered the distance between them in about 6 strides. "Hey," he said, crouching down. "Hey, are you—" She looked up at him. Her face was stunning in the way that doesn't register as beauty right away, but lands harder a second later, once the initial shock of the situation stops obscuring everything else. Dark hair, soaking wet, plastered against her neck and cheeks, eyes that were some complicated color between brown and green, rimmed red from cold or crying, or both. Her mascara had tracked down in 2 long streaks that she hadn't wiped away. She had the kind of cheekbones and jaw that belonged on a magazine cover, except right now her lips were going blue at the edges, and she was shaking so hard her teeth were clicking. She stared at him for a second. "I'm fine," she said. He blinked at her. "You're in a wedding dress. In a snowstorm. on a highway. I know where I am. Your hands are blue. She looked down at them. They were genuinely starting to go blue. She seemed to register this as a data point worth noting, but not necessarily a crisis. I just need to get back to my chair, she said. The grate of the shoulder caught the wheel and it tipped. If you could just... She gestured toward the wheelchair, which had come to rest with one wheel elevated on a small ridge in the asphalt. You don't need to do anything else. I just need the chair. He picked up the wheelchair, righted it, locked the brakes, and brought it to her. She didn't ask for help getting into it. She grabbed the armrests and hauled herself up in a movement that was clearly practiced, clearly something she'd done hundreds of times, and settled into the seat with a kind of controlled precision that told him she'd been doing this long enough that the mechanics of it were automatic. But her arms were shaking badly from the cold, and she slipped once on the wet armrest, and he put a hand on her elbow without thinking, and she accepted it without comment, which he suspected meant she was in worse shape than she was letting on. Once she was seated, she let out a breath. Then she looked up at him again. Thank you, she said. Like that was the end of it. Where are you going? He said. That's not really... She stopped, looked down the highway in both directions. The road was empty in both directions for as far as either of them could see. I'm figuring that out. In a wedding dress, in the snow. You mentioned the wedding dress already. You're not wearing shoes. She looked at her feet. Her feet were bare. They were the color of chalk. She looked at them for a moment with an expression that was hard to read. Not quite distress, not quite dismissal. Something more like a person doing a very fast, very private calculation about how bad the situation actually was. I left them in the car, she said finally. What car? A pause. The car I got out of. He looked around. There was no car. There was a highway and snow, and the two of them and the hazard lights on his truck blinking orange in the dark. How long have you been out here? He said. She didn't answer right away. Ma'am? Don't call me ma'am. Okay. He waited. She closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them again, something in her face had shifted slightly. Not softened exactly. More like the energy required to maintain a particular kind of composure had just run slightly short. About 40 minutes, she said. Maybe closer to an hour? An hour. He looked at her feet again, looked at her hands, looked at the dress, soaked through, doing nothing against the cold. You need to get warm right now. Like, right now. I'm aware of that. Is there somewhere I can take you? Family? A friend? A hotel? Another pause, this one longer. I don't... She stopped. Started again. I don't have anywhere I can go right now. Everything is... She pressed her mouth together. It's complicated. Okay, he said. He stood there for a second, the snow coming down between them, the hazard light strobing orange, orange, orange. He thought about Sophie at home with Mrs. Delgado, the neighbor who watched her when he worked late, a 70-year-old retired kindergarten teacher who left by 10 no matter what, and it was already 9:45. He thought about this woman's feet, which were the color of chalk. My name is Grayson, he said. Grayson Reed. I live about 15 minutes from here. I have a spare room and a working furnace, and I can have you warm in 20 minutes. She looked at him for a long moment. I don't know you, she said. No, he agreed. You don't know me either. No. She looked down the empty highway again, then back at him. The calculation was visible on her face. A woman who had clearly spent a long time making assessments, reading situations, deciding where the exits were. He could see her working through it. Isabella, she said finally. Isabella Vale. Okay, Isabella Vale, he said. Can I put your wheelchair in my truck? She held his gaze for another moment. Then she said, yes. His house was a 1940s colonial on just under an acre, the kind of house that had been renovated in stages by different owners with different aesthetics over the decades. So the kitchen was newer than the rest of it, and the bathroom off the master bedroom had subway tile that looked almost intentional, and the mudroom off the back still had its original pine floors, which creaked in a specific sequence, 3 short, 1 long, whenever you walked across it. Grayson carried her in through the front door because the porch steps had no ramp, and the snow had frozen into a crust that made the chair impossible to navigate. She didn't protest this. She held herself rigid during it, in the way of someone who found being carried physically tolerable but emotionally corrosive. And he set her in the living room armchair because it was closest and went back immediately for the wheelchair without drawing attention to any of it. Mrs. Delgado appeared at the top of the stairs. "There you are," she said. "I was starting to—" She stopped, looked at Isabella in the armchair, looked at the wedding dress, looked at Grayson. "It's a long story," he said. Mrs. Delgado came down the stairs, looked at Isabella's feet, and said, "Lord Almighty," and went immediately to the hall closet and came back with 2 pairs of wool socks and a fleece blanket that she wrapped around Isabella's shoulders before Grayson had even finished taking off his coat. "Your feet are going to hurt when they warm up," Mrs. Delgado said, pulling a second sock over Isabella's right foot with the matter-of-fact tenderness of a woman who had spent 30 years managing small disasters. "That's normal. Don't panic." "I don't panic," Isabella said. "Good," said Mrs. Delgado. She stood up, looked at Grayson. "Sophie had a nightmare around 8. She's back asleep." "Was she okay?" "She was fine. Came downstairs, had some warm milk, told me about a dream where a blue elephant was trying to steal her library book." She picked up her coat from the hook by the door. "She's fine. She always is." She paused, looking at Isabella again. "You want me to make tea before I go?" "I'll make it," Grayson said. "Thank you, Paloma. Seriously." After Mrs. Delgado left, the house went quiet. Just the furnace running and the sound of snow against the windows and the tick of the kitchen clock. Grayson made tea. He made it the way he'd learned when Sophie was sick, strong, with honey and a slice of ginger, the ginger because his wife had taught him that, and he'd never stopped doing it. He brought 2 mugs into the living room and put one on the end table next to Isabella. She had her hands wrapped around the mug before he'd even sat down. She didn't say anything for a while, just held the mug and let the warmth move into her palms, and he could see some of the rigid tension in her shoulders slowly, very slowly, start to ease. He didn't ask her anything. He drank his tea and let the silence be what it was. After about 5 minutes, she said, "You're not going to ask?" "About what?" "About the wedding dress. About why I was on the highway. About who I am." "I figured you'd tell me what you wanted to tell me." She looked at him, evaluating something. "Most people," she said, "would have been on their phones the second they saw me." "Looking up what?" "I'm not exactly unknown." He looked at her. "Should I know who you are?" Something shifted in her face. Not offense exactly, something more like surprise, and underneath that, something that might have been relief. "Isabella Vale," she said again, like maybe he'd missed the significance of it the first time. He thought about it. He worked construction project management. He read the sports section and the local news, and occasionally got pulled into articles about tech or business when they came up in conversation with clients. The name felt like it should register, and he could feel it almost connecting to something in the back of his mind, but it wasn't landing. "CEO," she said. "Vale Technologies. We're publicly traded. I've been on the cover of Forbes 3 times." "Okay," he said. "That's all you have? Okay? I mean," he set down his mug. "I'm sorry. Is there a response I'm supposed to give? I'm not trying to be rude, He looked at her. "You were barefoot in the snow for an hour. I'm more worried about whether your feet are actually okay than about your Forbes covers." She stared at him. Then, unexpectedly, she made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. It was too short and too surprised to be a real laugh, but it was adjacent to one. "My feet are fine," she said. "They hurt, like the woman said they would, but they're fine." "Good." He picked up his mug again. "Do you want to tell me what happened, or do you want to just sit here for a while?" She looked at the fire. He didn't have a fireplace, so she looked at the opposite wall, which was where a fireplace would have been if the house had one, and her expression had the particular quality of someone staring at something that wasn't there. "I was supposed to get married tonight," she said. "I kind of figured. His name is Victor Langston. She stopped. "He's very wealthy, very connected. My board of directors has been pushing for the merger. Not a business merger, an actual marriage, though for them there isn't really a difference, for almost 2 years. Our combined holdings would be—" She stopped again. "It doesn't matter what they'd be. Okay?" The ceremony was at the Whitaker estate. You know it? I've driven past it. 400 guests. There was a string quartet. There were flowers that cost more per arrangement than most people's monthly rent. She looked down at the tea. I got to the church. It's in the estate's chapel, and they had me waiting in this anteroom off the vestibule, and I could hear people through the wall, the sound of 400 people settling into their seats, and I thought— She went quiet for a moment. I thought, I have been in waiting rooms my entire life, my whole life, just waiting to be useful to someone else's plan. Grayson didn't say anything. My parents think I'm back in the city, she said. My board thinks I had some kind of episode. Victor thinks— She shook her head. Victor thinks I'll come back. He always thinks that. Will you? No. No hesitation at all on that one. He nodded. Okay. You keep saying okay. It's an okay kind of night. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said carefully, like she was testing whether the question would be met with something she didn't want. Why did you stop? Because you were on the side of the highway in the snow. A lot of people drove past me before you stopped. He thought about that. He thought about saying something simple and clean, something that would hold up to inspection. Instead, what came out was, I have a daughter, 8 years old. If she was ever on the side of a road somewhere and something was wrong, he stopped. I'd want someone to stop. Isabella looked at him for a long moment without speaking. The clock ticked in the kitchen. The furnace ran its cycle and clicked off, and the house settled into a slightly different register of quiet. The accident was 2 years ago, she said. A car accident. We were coming back from a retreat in Vermont, company retreat, because my life is a series of company things. And the road iced over on a curve. I remember the sound of the guardrail, and I remember a particular quality of spinning that felt like it lasted a very long time. And then I woke up in a hospital in Burlington, and a doctor I'd never met was explaining to me what T4 incomplete spinal cord injury meant. She paused. It means I have partial function. I can stand for short periods. I can take some steps with support, but I can't walk unaided for any meaningful distance. I may never be able to. She said all of this in a flat, informational tone that had clearly been practiced until it no longer caught on anything. Victor proposed 3 months after I was out of the initial rehabilitation program. My parents thought it was romantic. I thought— She stopped. What did you think? I thought he proposed because he needed to secure the merger before the quarterly reports, and my condition had removed what he saw as complications from the arrangement. I would be more controllable, more grateful. Her voice was level and without self-pity, and it was somehow that quality more than anything else that made him feel a dull anger on her behalf. I thought those things, and then I told myself I was being cynical, and I said yes, and I spent 2 years watching every single one of my instincts get confirmed. She looked at the mug in her hands. I am 30 years old, and until tonight I have never once made a decision purely because it was what I wanted. The clock ticked. Tonight you made one, he said. She looked up. You got out of the car, he said. Whatever the rest of it is, you got out, on your own, in a blizzard. Something moved across her face. It was gone quickly, but it had been there. I didn't plan to be on a highway, she said. I thought there would be more, options. There are always fewer options than you expect. That's bleak. That's just how it goes. He finished his tea. The spare room is at the top of the stairs, first door on the left. It's basic. There's a bed and clean sheets, and I think there are extra blankets in the closet. The bathroom is across the hall. He paused. I can put a towel at the bottom of the stairs. The third step creaks loud enough to wake up the whole house, but the railing is solid, and I can— He looked at her chair. I can carry the chair up, or I can set up the pull-out in the study on the ground floor. Either way. She looked at him. Why are you doing this? She said. I told you. You told me about your daughter. That's a reason to stop. It's not a reason to bring a stranger into your house. He thought about it honestly. I don't know, he said, which was the true answer. You looked like you needed somewhere to be. I have a somewhere. She held his gaze for a long moment with an expression he couldn't quite decode, something layered and careful and working through something. The pull-out is fine, she said finally. "If it's not too much trouble." "It's not." He didn't sleep much. He lay in his bed and listened to the snow, and thought about the school meeting and thought about Sophie and the things Mrs. Hartley had said. He thought about the brochure still folded in his jacket pocket. He thought about how Sophie had come downstairs at 8 with a nightmare and hadn't called for him, had gone to Mrs. Delgado instead, and what that meant or didn't mean. He thought about Isabella Vale on the side of a highway in a torn wedding dress, pushing herself through the snow with her bare hands, and the way she'd said, "I thought he proposed because he needed to secure the merger," in that flat, practiced voice that had smoothed away everything underneath it. He got up at 6. Sophie was already awake, which was unusual. She was sitting at the kitchen table in her pajamas, eating cereal and reading a book, the book propped against the cereal box the way she always did, which drove him a little crazy because it always got milk-splattered pages. She had her mother's hair, thick and dark brown, always a little tangled in the morning, and his jaw, which he felt obscurely guilty about because it was a strong jaw and probably not the thing you wanted to give your 8-year-old daughter. "Hey, Bug," he said. "Hey." She didn't look up from the book. He started the coffee. "Did Mrs. Delgado tell you she had a nightmare about elephants?" "It was a normal dream. The elephant wasn't trying to steal the book, it just wanted to look at the pictures." "You told her it was trying to steal it." "I told her it was looking very intensely. She exaggerated." Sophie turned a page. "There's someone sleeping in the study." He paused at the coffee maker. "Yeah." "A woman?" "How do you know it's a woman?" "Her shoes are by the door." Sophie looked up. "They're very fancy shoes, like formal shoes, but there's only one of them." He turned around. There was, in fact, a single cream-colored stiletto heel sitting near the entrance to the study. He had no idea where it had come from or how it had gotten there. He was going to think about that later. "She needed somewhere to stay last night," he said. "Her name is Isabella." Sophie looked at him with the particular expression she deployed when she was deciding whether to accept an explanation or excavate it further. She had been doing this since she was 5. He had never developed an effective defense against it. "Is she okay?" Sophie said. "She was cold. She's okay now." Sophie considered this. Then she looked back at her book. "I made sure I was quiet coming downstairs," she said, "so I didn't wake her up." He looked at his daughter. Something moved in his chest. "That was thoughtful, Bug," he said. Sophie turned another page. "She's going to need breakfast when she wakes up," she said, in the tone of someone pointing out a logistical reality. "We should probably have something good, not just cereal." "We have eggs." "We have eggs," Sophie confirmed. "And I think there are English muffins. Those would be better than cereal." He made eggs and English muffins. Isabella appeared in the kitchen doorway at 7:30. She'd slept in her dress because she had nothing else. The dress was a disaster, and she'd done what she could with it in the bathroom mirror, but there was no version of the situation where a torn silk wedding gown at a kitchen table before 8 in the morning was not a remarkable thing. She had washed her face and gotten the mascara off and pulled her hair back with something she'd found in her bag. Without the makeup and the formal circumstances, she looked younger somehow. And tired, but more real. She had maneuvered her chair to the doorway and stopped there, taking in the kitchen. The eggs on the stove, Grayson at the counter pouring coffee, Sophie at the table with her book and her cereal. Sophie looked up. She looked at Isabella for a moment. Then she looked at the dress. Then she looked back up at Isabella's face with the frank, unfiltered assessment that children deploy before they learn to filter it through social convention. "Your dress is really pretty," Sophie said, "even though it's ripped." "Thank you," Isabella said. "Did you sleep okay?" "I did, actually. Thank you for being quiet on the stairs." Sophie's expression shifted slightly, pleased and trying not to show it. "Dad told you I was quiet?" "He didn't have to. I heard you not waking me up." Sophie thought about this. Then she smiled, which was a thing that didn't happen on command and couldn't be produced by the right circumstances alone. It arrived on its own schedule, and when it came, it changed her whole face. "Do you want eggs?" she said. "Dad made them. He's actually pretty good at eggs, better than most other things." "Hey," Grayson said. "It's true," Sophie said to Isabella.
conspiratorial. He's not great at pasta. The eggs are good, though.
Isabella looked at Grayson. Something in her face had shifted from the careful assessment of the night before into something less guarded. Not because the guard had come down, but because the situation had done something unexpected to it. "I would love eggs," she said. She wheeled herself to the table. Sophie moved her cereal box over without being asked to make room, and the book came with it because the book was always wherever Sophie was. "What are you reading?" Isabella said. Sophie held up the cover. It was a novel about a girl who discovers she can communicate with whales. A chapter book, the kind of book that walked the edge between middle grade and something slightly older. "Is it good?" "The whale parts are really good. The parts about the school are kind of slow." Sophie set the book down. "Do you like to read?" "I used to. I don't have much time anymore." "For reading?" "For anything that isn't work." Sophie absorbed this. "That sounds bad," she said. Isabella looked at her. "It is," she said. "A little." Grayson set a plate in front of Isabella and one in front of Sophie, who had not asked for eggs but accepted them without comment, which meant she'd wanted them. He refilled his coffee and leaned against the counter and watched his daughter and this woman in a ruined wedding dress at his kitchen table, and something in the picture was so genuinely strange that for a moment the tight thing that had been sitting in his chest since the school meeting yesterday, since longer than the school meeting, if he was honest, went quiet. Outside, the snow had stopped. The backyard was blank and white and quiet under the low winter sky. "Can you see whales from here?" Sophie asked. "If you went to the ocean?" "You can sometimes," Isabella said. "In the right season, from the right places." "Have you seen one?" "A humpback, off the coast of Maine years ago. I was on a boat." Sophie's eyes widened. "What did it do?" "It breached." "It came out of the water." Isabella lifted one hand off the table, palm up, then tilted it forward and let it fall, and the gesture was simple and precise and somehow conveyed the size and weight and impossible grace of a thing that large moving through air. And then it went back under, like it had just wanted to look at something for a moment. Sophie stared at her. "Exactly like the book," she said. "Maybe," Isabella said. "A little." The kitchen was warm, the eggs were good. The snow in the backyard caught the low morning light and held it, and for a few minutes nothing pressed on anyone, and the world outside stayed where it was. The morning moved slowly, which was unusual for Grayson's mornings. He had work. He was in the middle of overseeing a commercial renovation in Stamford, the kind of job that generated 3 or 4 calls before noon. But it was Saturday, and the site wasn't running, and his phone was mostly quiet. He took it to the back corner of the house where his small office was and answered the emails that needed answers and left the others for Monday. When he came back out, Isabella had moved to the living room. She was sitting with Sophie, who had brought out a drawing project that lived in a battered cardboard box under the coffee table, markers, colored pencils, a pad of thick white paper. Sophie was working on something with focused intensity, tongue slightly visible at the corner of her mouth the way it always was when she was concentrating. Isabella was watching her, and there was something in her face that Grayson couldn't identify exactly, but recognized as the expression of a person who had not expected something and was in the process of adjusting to it. He stopped in the doorway. Sophie said without looking up, "Isabella told me about the whale again. I'm drawing it." He looked at Isabella. She looked back at him. "I hope that's okay." "Of course it's okay." "I don't want to—" She stopped. "You're not in the way," he said. "You're welcome here. For as long as you need." She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked back at Sophie's drawing. The whale, large and blue, breaching from a complicated ocean. "Thank you," she said. Not the clipped formal thank you from the night before. A different one. He went to make more coffee. He would call her a car service that afternoon, when she was ready, wherever she wanted to go. He'd figure out the logistics. He'd make sure she had what she needed. That had been the plan. The afternoon came and went. The car service didn't get called. Neither of them mentioned it. Lots. The first complication arrived on Sunday morning. Grayson was at the hardware store 2 towns over. A burst pipe fitting in the upstairs bathroom, which was its own separate category of problem, when his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. "Mr. Reed," a man's voice, smooth and certain of itself. "My name is Douglas Merritt. I represent Victor Langston and the Vale Technologies Board of Directors." Grayson stood in the plumbing aisle. "Okay. We believe you may have inadvertently offered shelter to Ms. Vale following some personal distress on Friday evening. We want to assure you there are no legal complications for you in this matter, provided Ms. Vale is returned to her family's care promptly." "Returned," Grayson said. "She requires specialized care that can't be adequately provided in—" A pause, calibrated. "In informal circumstances. She's not a missing object." "Of course not, but she is an adult," Grayson said, "who made her own choices Friday night." A beat of silence. "Mr. Reed, I'm going to be straightforward with you. Ms. Vale is going through a difficult period. She needs professional support, and does she know you're calling me?" Silence. "Does she?" Grayson said. "Know you're calling me?" The line went quiet for 3 seconds, which was all the answer he needed. "I appreciate your concern, Mr. Merritt," he said. "I'll pass along that you called." He hung up. He bought the pipe fitting. He drove home. Isabella was in the kitchen making tea, which she'd figured out after some pointed investigation of his cabinets that morning. She looked up when he came in. He told her about the call. Her expression did not change while he spoke. It was very still and very controlled, and he recognized that stillness now as the thing she deployed when she was processing something that required it. "Douglas Merritt," she said. "You know him." "He's been my board's outside counsel for 6 years. She set down the kettle. "They found me faster than I expected." "They didn't find you. They found me. They called me. That's—" She stopped. "That's Victor. That's how he works. He comes at the edges first." Grayson pulled out a chair and sat down. "What does that mean?" "Coming at the edges. It means he's not going to knock on your door in the first round. He'll try to make the situation around me uncomfortable. He'll call people. He'll make insinuations. He'll make it so that staying becomes harder than leaving." She said this with a matter-of-fact clarity that chilled him a little, not because of the words, but because of how completely she'd already mapped it. How many times this pattern had played out for her before in other contexts. "He's very good at it." "Does it work?" She looked at him. "It has worked," she said carefully. "In the past." "What's different this time?" She was quiet for a moment. "I'm different this time," she said. "I think." He held her gaze, then he nodded. "I'm not going to make it easier for him," he said. "If that matters." Something moved in her face. She looked away before it settled into anything he could name. "It matters," she said. Outside, Sophie was in the backyard making something elaborate in the snow, some kind of structure that had been going since after breakfast and showed no signs of conclusion. She was wearing his old ski jacket because it was warmer than hers, and it came down past her knees, and every few minutes she came to the back door to report on its progress with the gravity of someone managing a significant engineering project. She came to the back door at that moment, red-cheeked and bright-eyed, snow in her hair. "I need more sticks," she announced. "The kind that are still attached." "Where do sticks that are still attached come from?" "The tree," Grayson said. Sophie considered this. "That seems like cheating." "It's literally where sticks come from." Sophie looked at Isabella. "What do you think?" Isabella looked at her carefully. "I think if you pick up the sticks from the ground first, and you still don't have enough, then getting them from the tree isn't cheating." Sophie absorbed this. "That's fair," she said with some respect. "Okay." And she went back out. The kitchen was quiet again. "She's incredible," Isabella said. Not as a compliment exactly, more like an observation. "She really is," Grayson said. He was looking out the back window at Sophie crouching in the snow, examining something. "She really, really is." His phone buzzed on the counter. He looked at it. An email from an address he didn't recognize, subject line empty. He opened it and read 2 sentences and set the phone face down on the counter. "What?" Isabella said. "Nothing urgent," he said. She looked at the phone, then at him. "Grayson," she said. He turned the phone over and let her read it. It was short. It said, "Mr. Reed, The woman in your house has resources, connections, and vulnerabilities that you are not equipped to manage. Do yourself a favor. This isn't your problem. No name, no return address. Isabella read it twice. Then she set the phone down. Victor, she said. Probably. She looked out the window at Sophie. Her expression was complicated and tired, and something underneath it was sharpening into something else. I should go, she said. I'll figure something out. I don't want to bring this to your... Isabella. She stopped. If you want to go, he said, I'll help you go somewhere safe. But if you're saying you want to go because you think Victor Langston's email intimidated me, he picked up his phone and put it in his pocket. It didn't. Not even a little. She stared at him. I'm going to fix the upstairs pipe, he said. I'll be down in an hour. If you want to talk about what comes next, the company stuff, the legal stuff, whatever it is, I'll listen. I don't know anything about corporate law, but I know how to listen. He went to fix the pipe. When he came back down an hour later, Isabella was at the kitchen table with Sophie. Sophie had brought the drawing box in from the cold. They were both working on something, Sophie on her whale, Isabella on something else, her hand moving across the paper with the focus of a person who hadn't done something like this in years but still remembered how. Grayson stood in the doorway. He didn't say anything. He went to the kitchen and started making dinner, and the house held all three of them in its imperfect, creaking, warm way, and the world outside stayed out there where it belonged, at least for tonight. The pipe fitting held. Grayson tested it twice on Monday morning before he was willing to trust it, running the tap in the upstairs bathroom and crouching under the sink with a flashlight for longer than was probably necessary, pressing a dry rag against the joint to check for moisture. Nothing. He repacked his tools and came back downstairs and found a note on the kitchen counter in handwriting he didn't recognize. Small, slanted, slightly left. The kind of handwriting that suggests someone who learned it young and never really thought about it again. Coffee is fresh. Sophie left her lunch on the counter. Aye. He looked at the counter. Sophie's lunch bag was sitting there, the small blue one with the cartoon penguin on it that she'd had since first grade and refused to retire. He grabbed it, checked the clock, grabbed his keys, and made it to the school drop-off line with 4 minutes to spare. Sophie took the lunch bag without comment. Did Isabella make your lunch? He said. Sophie looked at the bag. She put a note in it. What kind of note? The kind you read at lunch. She opened the car door. Bye, Dad. He watched her walk up the path to the building, the oversized jacket she refused to replace, the slight hitch in her walk that came from the left sneaker she'd tied too loose again. She didn't look back, which she almost never did. He waited until she was inside before he pulled out of the line. When he got home, Isabella was at the kitchen table with her laptop open and her phone beside it, and the look of a person who had been working for hours. Her hair was pulled back. She was wearing one of his flannel shirts over her clothes because the house ran cold in the mornings, and he'd left it on the back of the chair, and she had a pen tucked behind her ear, and a legal pad covered in notes at her elbow. She looked, in other words, like a different person than the woman he'd found on the highway 4 days ago. Or maybe not different, more like the same person, but with something restored. Morning, he said. Your Wi-Fi password, she said without looking up. I need to change it. He stopped. Why? Because I connected my laptop to your network, and if Victor's people are monitoring my device activity, which they are, they now have your router's external IP. I can route through a VPN, but I'd rather just start clean. She looked up. Do you know how to change it, or do you want me to do it? He looked at her. I can figure it out. Your router is the black box in the office. The admin panel is usually at 192.168.1.1. Change the SSID and the password both. Make the password something random, not a word. He went and changed the router password. When he came back and read it to her, she typed it in without writing it down, which meant she'd already memorized it. Thank you, she said. Sure. He poured coffee. How long have you been up? Since 5. Have you eaten anything? A pause that told him the answer. He made toast and put it next to her laptop without making it a production, and she ate it absently without acknowledging it, the way you eat when you're working and your body is doing something your attention isn't available for. He recognized the behavior. He'd done it himself on bad project stretches. He didn't take it personally. He refilled his coffee and leaned against the counter. Do you want to tell me what you're working on? I'm trying to understand the extent of the damage before I decide on a strategy. She didn't look up. I have a very good memory for documents, but I've been in a particular situation for 2 years, and during that time, certain things were routed around me that I didn't fully appreciate at the time. She clicked something. Her jaw tightened. I'm appreciating them now. Bad? Possibly very bad. She picked up the pen from the pad, looked at what she'd written, set it back down. Victor and at least 3 members of my board have been making decisions about company assets that they don't have the standing to make unilaterally. I can see the surface of it in the documents I have access to, but the full picture is... She stopped. I need someone who knows corporate forensic accounting. I know people, but I don't trust the phones yet. You think they're monitoring your calls? I think Victor is capable of it, and I'd rather behave as though he is. She looked up. That probably sounds paranoid to you. A little, he said. But the email on Sunday was real, so... She held his gaze for a moment. Yes, she said. The email was real. He brought his coffee to the table and sat down across from her. Can I ask you something? You can ask. The accident, you said it was 2 years ago. You've been doing the rehabilitation since? She looked at him, a careful look, the kind that's deciding how much to give. On and off. The initial program was 8 months. I've had 2 rounds of additional therapy since. I can stand for short periods. I can take assisted steps in controlled conditions. She paused. It's not linear. It doesn't follow a schedule. Some weeks are better than other weeks, and some weeks you lose ground you thought you'd kept, and you have to learn how to not read that as a verdict. That sounds exhausting. It is, she said simply. No performance around it. It is exhausting, and nobody really tells you that up front. They tell you about milestones and progress, and they show you other people's success stories, which is fine, that's useful, but they don't quite tell you what it feels like to work that hard towards something that isn't guaranteed. She looked at the coffee mug she'd been nursing for hours. Victor used the accident as a reason to slow my schedule, to redirect more decision-making through the board while I was in recovery. He framed it as support. She said the word support the way you say a word you've turned over so many times it's gotten strange. By the time I understood what had actually happened, enough of the infrastructure had shifted that reversing it required... She stopped again. Effort. I wasn't sure I had. Grayson looked at her for a moment. But you have it now. I don't know what I have now, she said. I know what I don't want. That's usually enough to start with. She looked at him. Is that experience talking? Some of it. He turned the mug in his hands. My wife died 3 years ago. Car accident. Sophie was 5. He said it the way you say something you've said enough times that the words have become manageable, mostly. I had a company before that. Small commercial construction firm, 3 employees. Nothing like your world. But it was mine. After she died, I sold it. He paused. I don't know if that was the right call. I needed to simplify everything. Just reduce the number of things that could go wrong. And so I got rid of the thing I'd built and went back to working for someone else. And it was easier to manage, but I've never completely made peace with it. Isabella watched him. I still don't know if it was a mistake, he said. Some days I think it was the only reasonable decision. Some days I think I let grief make a permanent choice that I wasn't in a position to evaluate. He set down the mug. But I know what it is to have something taken from you during a period when you couldn't fight back. And I know what it is to look up later and realize the shape of what's missing. She didn't say anything for a moment. I'm sorry about your wife, she said. Thank you. What was her name? Kara. She said the name quietly, to herself, just the once, like she was filing it somewhere. Then she looked back at her laptop screen, but the quality of her looking had changed. She was still reading whatever was on the screen, but she was also somewhere else for a moment, somewhere that the information didn't reach. My parents, she said after a while. My parents are... They're not bad people. I want to be clear about that. They're not villains. They love me in the way that people love things they've invested significantly in. The pen moved between her fingers. My father built Veil Technologies from a small software consultancy. He spent 20 years making it something real. When I was 12, I started going to the office with him on weekends, and I was good at it. Good at seeing patterns, good at systems, good at the particular logic of how companies grow. By the time I finished my MBA, I wasn't joining the company as his daughter. I was joining it because I was the most qualified person he knew for the work. And when did it stop feeling like yours? She was quiet for a long moment. Gradually, she said, and then all at once. She closed the laptop halfway. After the accident, the narrative shifted. Suddenly, there were conversations about my well-being, my limitations, what I could realistically handle, and every single one of those conversations was with other people deciding what I could realistically handle, never me. Her voice was level. Victor's very good at language. He doesn't say you can't do this. He says, let's make sure you're protected. He doesn't say you're diminished. He says we need to be careful with you. And you hear those things enough times, from enough people, in enough rooms, you start to build a kind of cage out of other people's worry. Do you think they believed it? That you actually needed protecting? She considered this honestly. I think some of them did. I think my mother genuinely believed the merger was what was best for me. That stability and financial partnership and Victor's connections were things she wanted for me because she was afraid. She paused. I think Victor believed it about as much as he believed anything that wasn't a number in a column. Grayson was quiet for a moment. Then, what does the company actually do? I know the name. I don't know infrastructure software, enterprise systems, the kind of things that aren't glamorous but that half the country's logistics networks run on. We have contracts with 12 major hospital systems, 3 government agencies, and enough private sector clients that you'd recognize the names. She said this without pride exactly, with the flat factual ownership of someone describing the square footage of a house. It's not a Silicon Valley vanity project. It's infrastructure. It matters, which is the part that her voice shifted slightly. If Victor and those board members have been doing what I think they've been doing with the asset structure, there are downstream risks that go beyond a stock price. People's jobs, thousands of them, potentially. She looked at her laptop, which is why I need to know the full picture before I make a move. He thought about the email on Sunday. This isn't your problem. He thought about the phone call from Merritt. He thought about the specific way those things had been worded, not threatening exactly, but designed to make a person feel small and peripheral and out of their depth. The edges first. He'd thought about what she'd said and recognized the architecture of it, the way certain kinds of pressure worked not through force, but through attrition. I know someone, he said. She looked up. A guy I used to work with, before Kara, when I had the firm. He left construction and went back to school, accounting, then forensic accounting. He does mostly litigation support now. He's not connected to your world, which might actually be useful. She was watching him carefully. Would he be discreet? He's one of the more careful people I know, and he owes me a favor, which... He paused. I mean, I don't really think of it that way, but he'd take my call. She held his gaze for a moment. The calculation was happening again, that rapid internal processing he'd learned to recognize in her. But this time it moved faster. This time it landed somewhere different. What's his name? She said. Marcus Webb. I'll call him today. She nodded once. Then she opened the laptop fully and went back to work. And the kitchen moved forward into the morning, and neither of them said anything else for a while, which was becoming quietly and without ceremony its own kind of comfortable. Sophie came home from school and dropped her backpack on the floor directly inside the front door, which was a habit Grayson had been trying to redirect for 2 years without success, and announced that her friend Lily had told everyone in class that she had a famous person at her house. Grayson stopped. How does Lily know that? Sophie looked at him with the expression of someone who finds the question endearing. I told her. Sophie, I didn't say anything weird. I just said there was a woman staying with us, and she was fancy. She pulled off her boots and left them at a slight angle to each other in the middle of the floor, which was also a habit. Lily looked it up and said it was the lady from Forbes, and I said I didn't know what Forbes was, and Lily said it was a magazine for rich people. She tilted her head. Is that true? That there's a magazine just for rich people? It's more complicated than that. Does Isabella know she's in a magazine? I think she does, yeah. Sophie absorbed this. Then she went into the living room where Isabella was on the phone. A new phone. A prepaid one she'd bought through Marcus Webb's office as an intermediary, which had been Grayson's suggestion, which she'd accepted after thinking about it for about 30 seconds. She was speaking in the crisp, certain voice she used for professional conversations, the one that was noticeably different from her kitchen table voice, not colder exactly, but denser. The voice of someone who knew how every sentence was going to land before it left her mouth. Sophie sat on the floor outside the living room with a book and waited. When Isabella finished the call, Sophie said, "Lily looked you up." Isabella looked at her. "Your friend Lily. She says you're in Forbes." Sophie glanced up from the book. "She also said you were supposed to get married to a man who looks like a TV villain." A pause. "Does she?" She has an older sister who reads those kind of articles. She says he has a face that looks like he smells bad. Something passed across Isabella's face. She stopped. "That's actually not inaccurate." Sophie nodded, satisfied. "I thought so." She went back to her book. Isabella looked at Grayson, who was standing in the doorway trying not to laugh. "Your daughter," Isabella said. "I know," he said. "She said that so casually." "She says most things casually." Isabella looked at Sophie, who was reading with total absorption, the conversation apparently complete. "She gave me a note at lunch," she said. "She put it in her lunch bag this morning, and I slipped a note in with her lunch." "I know, she told me." "What did she—" Isabella stopped. "Did she tell you what it said?" "She said it was a lunch note, that lunch notes were private." Isabella looked at her hands. "I wrote, it was stupid. I wrote that she was the best thing in a 10-mile radius." She paused. "It was a dumb thing to write. She stopped again. "She's been carrying it in her pocket all day," Grayson said. "She showed me before bed last night, very carefully, like it was a document." Isabella didn't say anything. She looked out the window. Her jaw was set in the particular way he was learning, meant she was feeling something she'd rather not feel in front of anyone. He didn't push it. Marcus Webb drove up from Westport on Wednesday evening, a compact man in his mid-40s with close-cropped gray at his temples, and the quiet, assessing manner of someone whose job required him to find things people had worked very hard to hide. He sat across from Isabella at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a flash drive and asked precise questions for 90 minutes in a tone that was completely neutral and somehow also entirely respectful, and Isabella answered them with the same precision, pulling document names and figures from memory in a way that made Marcus occasionally pause and write something down. Grayson stayed in the room. Neither of them asked him to leave. He sat in the chair by the window and read the same 4 pages of a book 3 times and didn't interrupt. When Marcus left, Isabella sat for a moment with her hands flat on the table. "He's good," she said. "Yeah. He already has a theory." "Did he tell you what it is?" "Not fully. He wants to confirm it first." She looked at her hands. He said, if what he's seen in the documents I gave him is what he thinks it is, it's not just a governance problem. It's potentially criminal." She looked up. "Which I already suspected, but having someone like Marcus say it makes it," she paused, "more real." "Are you okay?" She considered the question with more honesty than he expected. "I don't know," she said. "I built that company. I know every system in it. And the idea that 2 or 3 people in expensive suits were using it to—" She pressed her mouth together. "I feel angry mostly, which is better than scared. Anger's useful. It is when it's pointed at the right thing." She looked at him. "I used to be angry at myself, for the accident, for the recovery, for letting things slip during that period. That's not useful anger." "No," he said. "It isn't." She held his gaze. "You know something about that." "Some." She nodded slowly and looked back at the table. "I've been here a week," she said. "I want to say, I know I came into this completely unprepared and dropped it all on you and Sophie, And I know this isn't what you signed up for when you pulled over on the highway, and I'm aware that, Isabella, she stopped. You're not an imposition, he said. I need you to understand that. She looked at him carefully. Sophie asked me yesterday if you were going to stay, he said. I told her I didn't know. She said, he stopped, almost let it go, then said it anyway. She said she hoped so. She said the house felt different. Isabella was very still. Different how? She said, quietly. She said it felt like more people. He paused. I think what she meant was that it felt fuller. Since Kara, she's been in a house with just me, and I try hard, but I'm one person and he stopped. She just needs more people around her. She always has. Isabella looked down at the table. The legal pad was in front of her, the pen beside it, and she picked up the pen and held it without writing anything. I don't know how to do this, she said. Do what? This. A gesture that encompassed the kitchen, the house, the general situation. I know how to run a company. I know how to read a room full of people who want to take something from me. I know how to manage my condition and my schedule and my public presentation and what to say in front of a camera. She set the pen down. I don't know how to be in someone's house and not feel like a problem to be managed. You're not a problem. I know you don't see me that way. She paused. I don't know how to let someone not see me that way. That's different. He was quiet for a moment, thinking about what she'd said and how true it was, and how long it probably took to understand something like that about yourself. My wife used to say, he started, then stopped because he didn't do this often, talk about Kara in full sentences, with context. He cleared his throat. She used to say that being cared for was a skill, that it took practice, that most people were so busy being competent that they forgot how to receive anything. He paused. She was usually talking about me when she said it. Isabella looked at him. She sounds like she was smart, she said. She was the smartest person I knew. He said it plainly, without weight. Sophie has her brain, different shape, but the same quality. Isabella nodded slowly. She looked out toward the hallway, in the direction of the living room where Sophie had gone after dinner, and her expression was the one he'd seen on her more than once now, open in a way she probably didn't know she was. The week that followed had a texture Grayson hadn't felt in years. His mornings had always been functional. Get Sophie fed, get Sophie to school, get himself to the site or the calls, reverse the sequence in the evening. It worked. It had always worked. But it was the tight efficiency of a system built for minimum friction, not for anything else. And he'd grown so used to it that he'd stopped noticing what was missing. Now the mornings were longer, not in a bad way. In the way of a room with more furniture, you moved differently through it, had to think about the path. Isabella made coffee every morning before anyone else was up, and she was always at the table by the time he came downstairs, working. But she looked up when he appeared and said something. Not always much. Sometimes just a comment on something she'd read. Sometimes a question about the project he was managing in Stamford. And it added a beat to the morning that hadn't been there before. Sophie, for her part, had begun treating Isabella with the particular mix of respect and familiarity that she normally reserved for adults she'd decided were worth knowing. She asked questions constantly, about the company, about what CEOs actually did all day, about the accident, about Vermont, about the whale. And Isabella answered them without simplifying, which Sophie noticed and appreciated. She also sometimes pushed back on Isabella's answers, which Isabella seemed to find genuinely entertaining, the way you find entertaining something you weren't expecting. Why do you have to go to so many meetings? Sophie asked one evening. They were at the kitchen table, Sophie doing homework, Isabella reviewing documents, Grayson cooking what was going to be, charitably, a serviceable pasta. Because that's how decisions get made in companies, Isabella said. People talk, negotiate, agree. But you're the boss. Can't you just decide things? Officially, yes. In practice? Isabella paused. In practice, companies are ecosystems. Everyone has their own agenda. You have to manage the relationships, not just the decisions. Sophie thought about this. That sounds exhausting, like being in third grade. Isabella's expression shifted into something close to amusement.
It's exactly like being in third grade. Sophie nodded gravely. I do not enjoy third grade. I know. How do you know that? Because you told me, Isabella said. Tuesday. You said, and I quote, that third grade was a series of disappointments, and you were biding your time. Sophie stared at her. You remembered that. I have a good memory. Dad doesn't remember stuff like that. I remember things, Grayson said from the stove. You remembered I said I didn't like the blue cup. That's it. That's the list. That's an important detail. Sophie looked back at Isabella. Do you actually want to hear the stuff I say, or are you just being polite? Isabella looked at her steadily. I don't do polite, she said. I do interested or I do quiet. I was interested. Sophie held her gaze for a long moment, doing her assessment. Then she nodded once, satisfied, and looked back at her homework. The pasta was slightly overcooked. Nobody said anything about it. The nights were harder, not in any dramatic way, just in the particular way that nights get hard when you're paying attention to something you've been successfully not paying attention to for a while. Grayson went to bed and lay in the dark and thought about things in a different order than he used to. He thought about Kara less and about the present more, which should have felt like progress and mostly did, but progress has its own kind of discomfort. The sense that moving forward is also always a kind of leaving. He heard Isabella sometimes, late, the soft click of her laptop, the occasional sound of her moving in the study, the muffled low register of a phone call he couldn't make out. She didn't sleep much. He'd learned not to ask about it. On Thursday night, he went downstairs at 11 for water and found her in the living room with the lights off, sitting in the dark looking out the window. The backyard was moon pale, the snow still thick on the ground and silvered now, the bare trees throwing long shadows across it. She heard him on the stairs and said, without turning, I'm not in distress. I just couldn't sleep. Okay. He got water, came and leaned in the doorway. You want company or you want me to go back up? A pause. Company is fine. He sat in the armchair. The room was quiet. Outside, the yard was still. I keep thinking about what happens next, she said. After Marcus has the full picture. After I make the move. What do you think happens? If I'm right about the extent of it, there's a fight, a real one. Victor doesn't concede anything. His lawyers are very good, and there are 4 of them for every one of mine right now. She paused. But I have the documentation trail if Marcus can reconstruct the full picture. And I have... She stopped. What? I was going to say I have nothing to lose, she said, but that's not true anymore. She looked at her hands. I have something to lose now. That's... She paused again. That's new. It's been a long time since I had something that wasn't just assets and positions. The house was quiet. Somewhere outside a branch gave under its snow load, and the sound was sharp and brief, and then gone. You're going to win, he said. She looked at him. Not because you have the documents, he said. You're going to win because you know your company better than they do. You always have. And now you're awake in a way you haven't been. He paused. That counts for something. She looked at him for a long moment in the dim, moonlit room. You have a strange kind of faith, she said. It's not faith. I've just been watching you work for a week. She turned back to the window. Something in her shoulders was different from earlier. The particular tension that lived there had shifted, not gone, but rearranged into something slightly less load-bearing. I keep thinking about Sophie, she said, about what Mrs. Hartley said to you, about the hard time letting people in. He was quiet. She lets me in, Isabella said. She did it on the first morning before she even knew anything about me. She just decided. She paused. I don't know if that says something about her or something about me or something about how 8-year-olds are better at this than the rest of us. All 3, probably. She smiled. Not the careful, managed expression she sometimes deployed. A real one, small and private, visible only because of the way the moonlight caught it. All 3, she agreed. She turned back to the window. He stayed in the chair. The snow in the yard held the light, and the house held the dark. And for a while neither of them said anything at all, and it wasn't the silence of 2 people with nothing to say. It was the other kind, the harder kind to find. Marcus called on a Friday. Grayson was at the Stamford site when it came through, standing in the shell of what was going to be a conference room on the fourth floor, drywall dust on his jacket, blueprints rolled under his arm. He saw Isabella's prepaid number and stepped away from the crew. "He found it," Isabella said. No preamble. "All of it?" "Enough. He's sending me the summary tonight, encrypted. But he walked me through the framework on the call." A pause. "The particular kind that precedes something large." "It's an asset reclassification scheme. Victor and 3 board members, Hargrove, Chu, and a newer member named Strand, have been reclassifying company-owned IP as jointly held assets through a series of subsidiary shell entities. The reclassification started 14 months ago, 8 months before the wedding date was announced." Grayson leaned against an unfinished wall. "So the wedding was the closing mechanism. Once we were legally married, Victor's claim on those assets through the joint property structure would have been substantially harder to unwind." Her voice was level, but just barely. "The IP involved includes our core logistics platform, the system that runs the hospital network contracts. If he'd completed the transfer, he'd have had effective leverage over the contracts themselves. Is that..." He tried to work out the scale of it. "What's that worth?" "In licensing terms? Conservatively, 8 to 900 million over the next 5 years. She paused. "Plus the position it would give him in the government agency contracts, which aren't valued in simple dollars." He stood there in the unfinished room with dust in the air and the sound of nail guns somewhere below him. "Isabella," he said, "I know. This isn't a governance dispute. I know what it is." Her voice was tight, controlled. "I need 2 more days to have everything organized. Marcus is working on a full forensic summary. I have outside counsel I trust, a firm in Boston that Victor has no connection to, and I've already reached out. But I need to move before he realizes I know, because the moment he knows I know, the document trail gets complicated." "How does it get complicated?" "Because some of the subsidiary entities are registered offshore, and retrieval of those records requires legal process that takes time. Right now, Marcus has the domestic documentation. I need to file before Victor has time to obscure the offshore layer." She stopped. "I'm going to call a board meeting. Emergency session. I still have the authority to do that as CEO. Barely, given the way the bylaws were amended, but I still have it." "He'll try to block it." "He can try, but the 5 board members who aren't compromised will vote to hold it, and that's a majority. Barely." Another pause. "I need to be in that room, Grayson. I need to be there in person." He looked out the paneless window opening at the gray February sky over Stamford. "When?" "I'm aiming for Wednesday. That gives Marcus time to complete the summary and gives my Boston counsel time to prepare the preliminary filings." She paused. "I haven't been in that building in 3 weeks. I haven't been in front of those people since before the wedding." He understood what she was saying and what she wasn't saying. "You'll be ready," he said. "I don't know that." "I know that." A beat of silence on the line. "I'll be home by 6, he said. "We can go through the board structure together tonight if you want. You can walk me through who's who, and I'll ask the dumb questions so you can hear your own answers out loud." She made a sound that was almost a laugh. "The dumb questions are sometimes the right ones. I've been told." He went back to the blueprints. He spent the rest of the afternoon doing his job and trying not to think about $800 million and shell companies, and the specific kind of person who could sit across a table from a woman he intended to marry and spend 2 years quietly stripping her life to the studs. He thought about it anyway. Tuts. They worked until midnight. Sophie was asleep. The kitchen table was covered in Isabella's legal pads, Marcus's preliminary summary printed on 20 pages, and 3 empty coffee mugs. Grayson had a yellow pad of his own where he'd been writing names and drawing the kind of rough charts he used on construction projects. Who was connected to what? Which nodes were load-bearing? Where the weak points were? It wasn't elegant. Isabella glanced at it once and said, "That's actually useful," in the tone of someone who expected less, which he took as a compliment. "Walk me through Strand again," he said. "The new board member. Appointed 11 months ago, nominally independent. His background is private equity, mid-size firm in Connecticut. Victor introduced him to the nominating committee." She tapped the page. On paper, he's the weakest link because his appointment is most recent and his documentation trail is thinnest, which means he had the least time to cover his involvement. In practice, he may be the most motivated to fight because he has the most to lose reputationally. He's positioned himself as a governance reformer in the PE world, which would make the fraud exposure worse for his brand. Exactly. She looked at the chart. Hargrove is the most dangerous. He's been on the board for 9 years. He knows where everything is. He'll be the one who moves fastest when I file, and I have to assume he has a countermove prepared. What kind of countermove? The legal agreement? She said it like she'd been carrying it. Victor told me about it 2 days after Douglas Merritt called you. There's a clause in the board's amended bylaws. The amendments that were made during my recovery, the ones I didn't fully understand the implications of at the time, that allows a supermajority of the board to temporarily suspend CEO authority in the event of what's described as a documented incapacity. Grayson was very still. Can they use the accident? They'll try. The language is vague enough that they could argue my absence from the company since the wedding, combined with what they'd characterize as a mental health episode, constitutes grounds. She looked at the table. It's not a strong argument legally, but it doesn't need to be strong. It just needs to delay. If they can suspend my authority for even 60 days while the legal challenge works through, the offshore transfer completes and the leverage point is locked in. He looked at her. So you need to move faster than 60 days. I need to move faster than the time it takes them to file the suspension motion, which could be as soon as I call the board meeting. She looked up. The filing from my Boston counsel has to be ready to go the same day I walk into that room. He nodded slowly. Can you have it ready? My lawyers are good. Marcus's summary is thorough. Yes. She paused. If nothing goes wrong in the next 72 hours, what could go wrong? She looked at him for a moment. Victor could find out where I am. Grayson set down his pen. He'd been careful. He'd changed the router. He'd asked Sophie to be vague if any adults asked her questions, which she'd accepted with the seriousness of someone who understood stakes without needing them spelled out. He'd kept his own communications clean. But 3 weeks was a long time, and Victor Langston had resources, and Merritt's firm had investigators, and the world was smaller than it seemed. Has anything... He started. Not yet. She held his gaze. But the calls have been escalating. My parents have been contacted. My mother called me twice today on the prepaid number. I don't know how she got it, which means someone traced it. She paused. Victor doesn't know I have Marcus's information. He still thinks this is about me being upset about the wedding. He's treating it like a runway bride situation, that framing is actually useful to me right now because it means he's underestimating the actual problem. She paused. He won't underestimate it after Wednesday. Grayson looked at his yellow pad, at the names and lines and the rough architecture of the thing she was walking into. I'm coming with you, he said. She looked at him. To the board meeting, he said. I can't go in the room, I know that, but I can drive you there. I can be in the building. You don't need to? I know I don't need to. He held her gaze. I want to. She looked at him for a long moment. The kitchen clock ticked. The house was very quiet with Sophie sleeping upstairs and the world outside doing whatever it was doing at midnight. Okay, she said. Victor Langston arrived on a Saturday. Not with a phone call. Not with another email through Douglas Merritt. He arrived in a black Mercedes SUV, a second car behind it, and he parked in front of Grayson's house at 11 in the morning when Sophie was in the backyard and Isabella was on a call with her Boston lawyers, and Grayson was splitting firewood by the side of the house. He was tall. That was the first thing Grayson noticed. Victor was tall and well-tailored and had the particular build of a man who worked out with a personal trainer 4 days a week, which was a specific kind of physicality, deliberate and maintained. He was somewhere in his mid-50s, silver-haired, with a face that was still handsome in a way that would photograph well. He looked like the kind of man who was used to being the most significant person in a room. He walked up the front path without hesitation. Grayson set down the axe and came around the side of the house. Mr. Reed? Victor stopped. He looked at Grayson the way that certain people look at obstacles. Not with contempt exactly, more with the practiced neutrality of a man who has already decided how he feels about something and is simply managing the expression of it. I hoped we'd be able to speak. She's not going back with you, Grayson said. Victor smiled. It was a good smile, practiced and warm, the kind you got with the tailored suit. I understand why you'd say that, I really do, but I think there are some things you don't fully understand about the situation Isabella is in. She can tell me what she wants me to understand. She's not... When Isabella is in a certain state of mind, she has difficulty with the full picture. Victor's voice was measured, concerned, the voice of a man deeply worried about a woman he cared about. The accident affected her more than she'll admit. The doctors have said, which doctors? A pause. I'm sorry? Which doctors said that? What are their names? Victor's smile held, but something behind it shifted slightly. I don't think this is the right... Because Isabella's neurologist, her physiatrist, and her current rehabilitation specialist all gave her a clean cognitive assessment in October. Grayson had learned this from Isabella. He had not verified it independently. He stated it like a fact because it was a fact. So I'd be interested in which doctors you're talking about. A beat of silence. The second car had disgorged two men in suits who were standing by the Mercedes without moving. Not security exactly. Lawyers, Grayson thought, or something in between. You seem like a reasonable man, Victor said, and the warmth was still there in his voice, but there was something under it now, something that had been there the whole time but was closer to the surface. I know this situation feels complicated, but Isabella's company, the company her father built, that she's dedicated her life to, is in a critical period. She has legal obligations. She has board obligations. She made a commitment to marry you, and she changed her mind, Grayson said. That's her right. There are contractual elements. Talk to her lawyers about contracts. Grayson looked at him steadily. She's not available to you right now. Victor looked at him for a long moment. The measured warmth was still on his face, but his eyes had gone to something cooler. Grayson had met men like this on job sites, the kind who managed through pressure applied at angles, who never raised their voices because they didn't need to, who understood that the most effective kind of control was the kind that looked like something else. Mr. Reed. Victor's voice dropped slightly, not in volume, but in register. You're a construction project manager. You have a daughter. You have a mortgage on this house that, unless I'm mistaken, runs through 2041. He paused. I understand the instinct to help someone who seems to need it. I do. But this situation has dimensions that are going to become very complicated very quickly, and the people in the peripheral orbit of that complication sometimes find themselves affected. Grayson looked at him. He kept his face still. Are you threatening me? He said. Not a question, a clarification. I'm expressing concern, Victor said. Okay. Grayson took a step toward him, not aggressive, just closing the distance enough that Victor would have to decide whether to hold his ground. Victor held it, but something in his posture adjusted. I've got your concern. Now I'd like you to get back in your car. A pause. She's going to lose the company, Victor said, quietly, like a final card. She doesn't have the support she thinks she has. The board, get in your car, Mr. Langston. Another pause. Victor held his gaze for 5 full seconds, which was long enough to be a statement. Then he turned and walked back to the Mercedes. One of the suited men opened the door for him. The car sat for a moment at the curb, engine running, and then it pulled away. Grayson stood there until both cars were out of sight. He became aware, gradually, of a sound behind him. He turned. Sophie was standing at the corner of the house in her winter jacket, her hands in her pockets, watching the street where the cars had been. That was him, she said. Not a question. Yeah. He looks like what Lily said. She paused. He does have that face. Grayson let out a breath. Go back inside, Bug. Don't say anything to Isabella yet. I'll tell her. Sophie looked at him. Why not yet? She's on an important call. I don't want to interrupt it. Sophie thought about this. Is she going to be okay? He looked at his daughter. At the particular quality of worry in her face that she was trying not to show, the tightness around her eyes that she had, he'd always thought, inherited from him. Yeah, he said. She's going to be okay. Sophie held his gaze for a moment with the expression of someone deciding whether to accept the answer or push further. Then she nodded and went inside. He stayed at the edge of the yard for another minute, looking at the street. Then he went in after her. Isabella took the news quietly. She was off her call by then. She was at the kitchen table, which was where she always was, and she listened to Grayson's account without interrupting, her face still, her hands flat on the table. When he finished, she said, "The mortgage." "Yeah." He looked it up. Probably had it before he got here. Grayson sat down across from her. It didn't land the way he wanted it to. He wouldn't have said it if he wasn't getting frustrated. She looked at the table. Him coming here personally? That's not his style. Victor sends people. He doesn't appear himself in situations he can't control. She paused. He's more concerned than I thought, which means he's closer to understanding what I know than I thought. How close is close? Close enough that the timeline matters more than it did yesterday. She looked up. I need to call my Boston counsel and move the filing timeline up. I was targeting Wednesday. I need to see if we can do Monday. Can Marcus have his summary done by then? I'll call him. She already had the phone in her hand. Then she stopped. Grayson, he looked at her. The mortgage, she said. The threat. I need you to understand that if this becomes a problem for you, if he actually pursues that kind of, he won't. You don't know that. He threatened me to try to scare me away from helping you. If I'm away from you, the threat is worthless. He held her gaze. So he'd have to follow through on it even though it doesn't get him what he wants, which is a waste of leverage. And he doesn't strike me as someone who wastes leverage. She looked at him for a moment. She stopped. What? That's exactly right, she said. That's how he thinks. She paused. How did you know that? Because it's how I'd think. Something moved in her face. She looked back at the phone. Call Sophie in, she said. She was outside. She saw him. I know. I heard some of it through the window. She was dialing. She shouldn't be alone with this. She's 8. Into the phone. Andrew, it's Isabella. I need to talk about moving the timeline. Grayson went to find Sophie. Monday came fast. Grayson drove Isabella to Boston in his truck, which she accepted without comment, though he suspected that, under different circumstances, Isabella Vale arrived at board meetings in town cars with prior scheduling. She was in a charcoal suit she'd had couriered to the house from a service in New Haven, the first real clothes she'd had since the wedding dress. And she had her laptop bag across her lap and her legal pad and 3 printouts of Marcus's summary, and she looked entirely like what she was, the CEO of a $4 billion company who had spent 3 weeks in a borrowed flannel shirt in someone's kitchen preparing to take her life back. They didn't talk much on the drive. She reviewed her notes. He drove. The radio played low, and neither of them changed it. At a light in Stamford, she said, without looking up from her notes, "Thank you for driving." "Sure." "I mean for everything." She was still looking at the notes. "The last 3 weeks." "I mean all of it." He glanced at her. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." She looked up. "I want to." He nodded. The light changed. He drove. The Vale Technologies building was in the financial district, 42 floors of glass and steel that had been, he knew now, the central project of her professional life for almost a decade. She looked at it through the windshield as he pulled up, and her expression was complicated. Not the face of someone coming home, not quite. More like the face of someone returning to a place they had strong feelings about and weren't sure yet which kind. "Do you want me to come in?" he said. "The lobby. You can wait in the lobby." She paused. "I know it's fine." He got out and got her chair, and she made the transfer without help, which she always did, and he held the door and followed her in. The lobby was vast and corporate and entirely silent at 8 in the morning except for a security desk where a uniformed man looked up when they came in. His eyes went to Isabella, and something happened in his face. Recognition, and then something more complicated than recognition. "Ms. Vale," he said. "Marcus." She stopped at the desk. "Is the board assembled?" "They've been arriving since 7:30. He paused. "Mr. Langston is here." She'd known he would be. He could tell from the way she didn't react. "Thank you." The security guard looked at Grayson. "He's with me," Isabella said. They went to the lobby seating area, a arrangement of low chairs and a coffee station near the windows. She stopped and turned to face him. "This is going to take most of the morning," she said. I'll be here." She looked at him. The morning light came through the lobby windows, and she looked very clear-eyed and very tired and very certain. "If they try to invoke the suspension motion," she said, "my lawyers file simultaneously, which triggers a freeze on the asset transfers pending judicial review. That's the mechanism. Once the freeze is in place, Victor's leverage is gone and he knows it." She paused. "It should work. Legally, it should work. It will work." She held his gaze. "You keep saying that like you know it." "I know you. 3 weeks is enough to know you." He meant it. "You're going to go up there and you're going to take your company back." She was quiet for a moment. "If Sophie asks where we went today," she said carefully, "tell her we ran errands." He almost smiled. "She's not going to believe that." "No," Isabella agreed. "She's not." The smallest, most private version of a smile. But try anyway. She turned and wheeled to the elevator. He watched the doors open and close, watched the numbers climb on the panel above. He got coffee from the station. He found a chair with a view of both the elevator bank and the entrance. He sat down. Victor Langston walked through the lobby at 8:47. He didn't see Grayson, or if he did, he gave no sign of it. He was with 2 other men, Hargrove, presumably, and one of the attorneys. And they were moving with the controlled speed of people who believed they understood the shape of the morning. Victor looked composed and certain, and like a man who had made this walk many times and expected to make it many more. Grayson watched them cross the lobby and get into an elevator. He finished his coffee. He got another one. He sat. He thought about Isabella upstairs in a room full of people who had, for 2 years, used her company like a mechanism. He thought about what she'd told him at midnight at the kitchen table, about the asset reclassification scheme and the shell entities and the wedding as a closing mechanism, and the particular cold architecture of it. Not just greed, but the long patience of it, the careful construction of a plan that required her to be diminished in order to work. He thought about Victor in front of his house, mentioning the mortgage. He thought about Sophie asking if Isabella was going to be okay. At 10:12, his phone buzzed. A text from Isabella's number. 4 words. Filing just went through. He sat with it for a moment. Then he texted back, "Good." A pause. Then, "He didn't expect it. You should have seen his face." He looked at that for a moment. Then, "I wish I had." Another pause. Longer. Then, "Come home. I'll tell you everything." He read that sentence twice. The word home, used without apparent consideration of what it meant, what it assumed, what it revealed about the last 3 weeks. He put the phone in his pocket. He went to wait by the elevator. Thus, she came down at 11:30. He could see before the elevator doors were fully open that something had happened. Not because she looked victorious. She didn't exactly. She looked like someone who had just walked out of a burning building, which was its own kind of thing, the particular exhaustion of having done something very hard and having it work. She had her laptop bag and her legal pad, and the 3 Marcus summaries were now annotated densely in her precise leftward handwriting. She came out of the elevator and stopped when she saw him standing there. "Well?" he said. "The suspension motion was filed at 9:14, she said. "My lawyers filed simultaneously at 9:15. The asset freeze order was granted by 10:08. She paused. Hargrove moved to contest immediately. His attorney was loud about it. Another pause. Victor didn't say anything for a long time. He just sat there, and then he said... She stopped. "What did he say?" She looked at Grayson. "He said, 'This isn't finished.'" Grayson held her gaze. "What did you say?" "I said, 'No, but this part is.'" She looked at the lobby. "Then I called the vote on the emergency resolution to refer the asset reclassification documentation to the SEC and law enforcement." She paused. "It passed 6-3. He was quiet for a moment. 6-3. "Strand voted with me." She almost looked surprised. I think he saw the wall and decided which side he wanted to be on. She shook her head slightly. Smart. Are you okay? She considered this honestly, the way she'd been doing lately. The way he'd noticed was different from how she'd done it in the beginning. I'm tired, she said. I'm very tired, and I need to eat something, and I need to see Sophie. She looked at him. And I'm okay. Yes. He nodded. He took the laptop bag from her without asking, and she let him without comment, which was its own kind of thing. They went out through the lobby together, through the glass doors and into the cold February air, the city going on around them the way cities do, indifferent to what had just happened 40 floors above the street. Her company was still hers. Victor's empire had a crack in it that was going to grow. And somewhere on the drive back through Connecticut, past the bare winter trees and the familiar exits, Isabella Vale fell asleep in the passenger seat of a construction project manager's truck, her legal pad still in her lap, her head tipped slightly against the window. Grayson drove. He turned the radio down. He let her sleep. She slept for 11 hours the night they got back from Boston. Grayson knew because he checked twice. Once at midnight, when the house was quiet and the strip of light that usually showed under the study door was dark, and once at 6 in the morning when he came downstairs and it was still dark. He made coffee quietly and sat at the kitchen table with his phone and read through the construction emails he'd been letting stack up during the past week and tried not to think too hard about what the next few months were going to look like. Sophie came down at 7 and immediately looked at the study door. She's still sleeping, Grayson said. Sophie poured herself cereal, sat down, opened her book. After a minute, she said, Did it go okay yesterday? The errand? He looked at her over his coffee. Yeah, Bug, it went okay. Sophie nodded and ate her cereal. She didn't ask anything else, which meant she'd already understood more than he'd told her and had decided that was enough for now. He watched her reading and thought about what Mrs. Hartley had said about difficulty letting people in, and how wrong it seemed in this particular kitchen at this particular table, and how grief did strange things to children that looked like personality but were really just protection. Isabella emerged at 8:30, which was the latest Grayson had seen her surface in the 5 weeks she'd been there. She appeared in the kitchen doorway in her chair, her hair down, wearing the oversized flannel shirt again over her clothes because the morning was cold, and she looked rested for the first time since the highway. Still tired around the eyes, the deep kind of tired that one night doesn't touch. But the particular exhausted tension that had lived in her face for weeks had loosened. Sophie looked up. The errand went okay, she said. Dad told me. Isabella looked at Grayson. I tried, he said. You're both very bad at secrets, Sophie said, and went back to her book. Isabella came to the table and poured coffee and sat for a moment without looking at anything specific, just holding the mug. Grayson made eggs without asking whether she wanted them, because she always wanted them and never said so, and put a plate in front of her, and she ate without commenting on the texture, which meant he'd gotten it right this time. My lawyers called this morning, she said eventually. Early. Good news? Mixed. The asset freeze is holding. Victor's attorneys filed a challenge overnight, but the judge denied the emergency stay, which means the freeze stays in place pending full review. That's the good part. She paused. The SEC contacted my outside counsel yesterday evening. They want a meeting, which is expected. The board referral triggers that process. But the timeline is faster than I anticipated, which means they may have been watching some of this already. Is that good or bad? If they were already watching, it means there's a parallel investigation that my filing just confirmed and accelerated. She looked at the table. For Victor, that's very bad. For me, she paused. It's complicated. I'm cooperating fully, which my lawyers advised and which I would have done regardless. But full cooperation means interviews, documents, a process that's going to be visible. She looked up. The company has clients who depend on stability, hospitals, government agencies. I need to get ahead of the narrative before it gets defined for me. Press release? Statement. Today, probably. My communications director, who has been trying to reach me for 5 weeks through increasingly desperate channels, has been briefed and is ready to go. She paused. I have to go back. The kitchen went quiet. Not awkward exactly, More like the kind of quiet that settles over a room when something that was always coming has finally arrived. "I know," Grayson said. She looked at him. "Not yet. I mean, not immediately. There are things I need to have in place before I'm back in that building full-time. Legal things, structural things. My Boston counsel thinks 4 to 6 weeks before the governance question is fully resolved." She paused. "But I can't run the company from your kitchen table indefinitely." "I know," he said again. "Sophie," she stopped. He waited. "I don't know how to do this part," she said. "The leaving." She said it flatly and without self-pity, which was worse somehow than if she'd dressed it up. "I've been leaving things my whole life, and I always had the next thing. The next meeting, the next quarter, the next obligation. There was always something to step into." She looked at the table. "This is different." He looked at her for a long moment. "It doesn't have to be a leaving," he said. "Greenwich is 45 minutes from the city." She looked up. "I'm just saying," he said. "It doesn't have to be a leaving." She held his gaze. Then she looked at her eggs, and she ate the rest of them in silence, but the silence had a different quality than before. Sophie, without looking up from her book, said, 45 minutes is not that far." Neither of the adults said anything. "I'm just saying," Sophie said, and turned a page. Look, the formal legal process moved the way formal legal processes always moved, in concentrated bursts of activity separated by long stretches of waiting that were not actually waiting because during the waiting, you were preparing for the next burst. Victor's legal team filed 3 separate challenges in the first 2 weeks following the Boston board meeting. All 3 were denied. Hargrove resigned from the board in the 3rd week, citing personal reasons in a letter that his lawyers had clearly written and that said nothing while using many words. Strand, the board member who had voted with Isabella, reached out directly and asked to meet. She met him in a conference room in her Boston lawyer's office with 2 attorneys present, and he spent 90 minutes providing documentation that significantly strengthened the timeline of the asset reclassification scheme, documentation he had, he said, been collecting since the previous fall. Whether that was true or whether Strand had simply seen the direction things were falling and decided to get on the right side of it efficiently, Isabella told Grayson afterward she didn't particularly care. The documentation was real, and it was useful. The SEC investigation became public in week 3. Vail Technologies stock dropped 11% in 2 days. It recovered 6 points by the end of the week when Isabella gave her first public interview in 6 weeks, seated at a conference table in her Boston lawyer's building, composed and specific and direct in a way that the financial press, who had been expecting either stonewalling or crisis management spin, found somewhat disorienting. She did not discuss the personal circumstances of why she had left the wedding. She discussed the governance failures, the specific mechanisms of the asset scheme, and the remediation steps she was implementing. She used precise language and she did not perform distress, and she answered the questions she was willing to answer with enough specificity to demonstrate that she understood her company at a level of detail that made it very difficult to sustain the narrative Victor had been seeding. That she was diminished, that she needed managing, that the company had outgrown her capacity. She sent Grayson a text that evening. That went as well as it could. "I hate cameras." He texted back, "You look like you'd done it 100 times. I have done it 100 times. I still hate it. Fair enough." A pause. Then, "Sophie sent me a voice memo this afternoon. She said good luck. She made it sound like a board meeting was something terrifying. To Sophie it would be. To most people it would be. She said, and I quote, 'I hope you made them feel embarrassed for being bad.' I did not tell her that's not quite how it works. That's exactly how it works." A longer pause. "Maybe." The rehabilitation program was a conversation that had been building for weeks without quite arriving. Dr. Nora Ellison had been Isabella's physiatrist since the initial recovery, a compact, precise woman in her 50s who communicated in the clipped technical register of someone who valued accuracy over comfort and had learned that her patients usually preferred it that way. She called Isabella on a Thursday in the 5th week after Boston to discuss what she called a recalibration opportunity. Isabella told Grayson about it that evening. He'd driven down to New Haven, where she was temporarily staying at a company apartment while the governance resolution continued. and they were sitting in the apartment's small kitchen with takeout containers open between them. Thai food, Sophie's favorite, which meant they'd ordered it partly in the habit of ordering for 3, even though Sophie was home. "There's a program at a rehabilitation center in New Haven," Isabella said. "I've known about it for a while. Dr. Ellison has been recommending it since last fall." She looked at her food. "I said no 3 times. "Why?" Because the timing was always wrong, or the commitment was too significant, or I told myself I'd do it after the merger was finalized." She paused. "Which was a lie I was telling myself. The real reason was that committing to a rehabilitation program means committing to the possibility that it won't work. And if you don't commit, you don't have to measure the outcome." He looked at her. "And now?" "Now I have fewer reasons to avoid the measurement." She looked at her hands. "It's 12 weeks. Intensive. There's an experimental approach that combines standard physio with a neurostimulation protocol that's shown significant results in incomplete injury cases like mine. Dr. Ellison says she says the window for this type of response is still open for me. That my injury profile makes me a strong candidate." She paused. "She's said this before. I just didn't want to hear it. What changed?" She was quiet for a moment, then, "I ran across a highway in the snow in February to get away from my own life. Something changed." She looked at him. "I want to know what my body can do. I've been afraid of that question for 2 years. I don't want to be afraid of it anymore." He nodded. "When does it start?" "Dr. Ellison can get me in 2 weeks, which coincides roughly with when the governance resolution is expected to conclude." She paused. "It's 12 weeks of intensive work. It's going to be..." She's been honest that it's going to be difficult. Not every session shows progress. Some sessions feel like going backward. The neurostimulation is uncomfortable. She said uncomfortable the way doctors probably said it to her, which meant painful. And the outcome isn't guaranteed. She's been very clear about that. Significant improvement is possible. Complete recovery is not a realistic expectation. Does that matter to you? The complete part? She thought about it honestly. 3 months ago it did. It was the only outcome that felt acceptable to me, which meant any partial improvement felt like failure. She paused. "I think I've been carrying a standard I set when I was in the hospital in Burlington, and I was frightened, and I thought that if I just worked hard enough and did everything right, I could get back to exactly what I was before." She looked at the table. "That's not how bodies work. And I'm not the same person I was before." He was quiet for a moment. "You're better," he said. She looked at him. "Not because of the injury," he said. "Just, you know yourself better. You're harder to push around." He paused. "The person you were before might not have gotten out of that car." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked away, and he could see her processing that, turning it over, deciding whether to let it land or file it somewhere safer. "I'm going to do the program," she said. "I know. I might not be able to drive for portions of it. The neurostimulation affects fatigue levels." She paused. "I was wondering, Sophie's spring break is in week 6. I know you were going to take the week off anyway for her. If you wanted to." "We'll come," he said. She looked at him. "I haven't finished the sentence." "You were going to say if we wanted to visit during the week. We'll come." A pause. "You don't know what my rehab center looks like." "I don't care what it looks like." She looked at him for a long moment, something in her face that she mostly managed not to show. The thing underneath the competence and the legal pads and the precise memory and the careful calculations was right at the surface for a moment. He'd learned not to look away when it appeared. He'd learned that looking away was what she expected. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he agreed. They ate the rest of the Thai food. He drove back to Greenwich at 10, and the highway was quiet and the radio was low, and he thought about a woman in a wedding dress on a shoulder 30 miles north, and how much road there was between that night and this one. The 12 weeks were not a movie montage. That was the thing about rehabilitation that nobody who hadn't been through it could quite understand, Isabella told him one afternoon in week 4 when he and Sophie had come down for the day. They were in the center's outdoor courtyard, A sheltered space with a flat walking surface and parallel bars, and a bench where Sophie was sitting cross-legged doing homework with total absorption. The afternoon was warm. April, the first genuinely warm day of the year, and the light came through at a low angle and made everything look slightly more hopeful than it was. People think it's linear, Isabella said. She was at the parallel bars, standing, weight distributed between her hands and her legs in the careful architecture she'd been working on for 3 weeks. They think you get a little better every day, and then one day you walk out. She took a step. Careful, deliberate, her left leg moving with more authority than her right, but both moving. It's not like that. It's like 3 steps forward, and then a session where everything seizes up and you feel like you're back at the beginning. And you have to learn how to not read that as information about the endpoint. Is today a 3 steps forward day or a seizure up day? Sophie asked, without looking up from her homework. Isabella looked at her. 3 forward, maybe. That's good, Sophie said, and turned a page. Isabella took 2 more steps. Grayson watched without comment, which was what she'd asked him to do. Watch, don't narrate, don't encourage too much because it made her self-conscious about what she looked like rather than what she felt. He watched. She made it to the end of the bars and stopped, breathing harder than the distance warranted, and turned herself around with the slow, careful movement of someone for whom turning is also a project. Dr. Ellison thinks the neurostimulation protocol is working, she said. Not dramatically. But the signal conduction in the T4 region is showing response that wasn't there in October. She paused. She was careful not to overpromise, but she used the word promising, which from Nora Ellison is roughly equivalent to someone else saying extraordinary. Nora? Sophie said. Dr. Ellison. You call her Nora. We've been working together for 2 years. Sophie considered this. I call my doctor Dr. Patterson. She calls me Sophie. I think that's unfair. You're 8, Isabella said. When you're 30, you can call her whatever she says. Sophie appeared to file this as reasonable. She went back to her homework. Isabella came back down the bars, slower this time, the fatigue showing in her arms. She stopped at the middle and rested. Grayson brought her chair around from where it waited at the side of the courtyard without being asked, positioned it at the right angle, and held it steady while she sat down. Thank you, she said. Sure. She sat and caught her breath. The afternoon light was on the courtyard. Sophie had moved from her homework to drawing something in the margins of her notebook, which was technically not allowed, but which Grayson had long since stopped trying to prevent. Victor's lawyers filed another challenge last week, Isabella said. Number 7. What was this one? Attempting to reclassify the Boston filing as a hostile act that voided certain board protections. She said it with the flat exhaustion of someone who had been fighting the same battle for 3 months and knew they were winning but hadn't slept properly since February. Denied, same as the others. My lead attorney thinks he's running out of legal surface to work with. The SEC investigation is deepening. They subpoenaed Langston Capital's internal communications last week, which means they're moving well past the Vail connection into his other holdings. That's Victor's problem now, not mine. She looked at her hands resting on her knees. He spent 2 years building something to take from me. I spent 3 weeks in a house in Greenwich, and I've spent 12 weeks in rehabilitation, and now I'm going to take the rest of it back. She paused. It's not complicated when you say it like that. It wasn't simple to do. No, she agreed. It wasn't. Sophie looked up from her notebook. Can I show you something? She came over and held up the notebook. She'd drawn the courtyard, rough, energetic, with Sophie's characteristic tendency to make everything slightly larger than life. The parallel bars were there, and the bench, and 2 figures that were clearly Grayson and Sophie herself. And at the bars, a figure standing upright, lines suggesting movement and light around it. That's you, Sophie said to Isabella. Standing. Isabella looked at the drawing. You're not in the chair, Sophie said. I drew it how it's going to be. Isabella looked at it for a long moment. She pressed her lips together in the way she did when she was feeling something she wasn't going to name in front of anyone. I like it, she said. You can have it, Sophie said, and tore the page out carefully and handed it over. Then she went back to the bench.
Isabella folded the page and put it in her jacket pocket. It against her chest. Grayson looked at his daughter. She was already back in her notebook, drawing something else, entirely unbothered, as if she hadn't just done something significant. He thought about Mrs. Hartley and the word about difficulty letting people in, and he thought it was the most wrong thing anyone had ever said about Sophie Reed, and also maybe he understood better now that it had always been about direction. That Sophie let people in completely and without reservation once she'd decided, and the question had always been only whether they were worth the decision. She'd made hers in week 1. He wondered if he'd made his as quickly and just taken longer to admit it. Victor Langston was indicted in June. The charges came through the Southern District of New York: securities fraud, wire fraud, and a conspiracy charge that implicated 2 of his Langston Capital associates and one of the offshore entity managers who had been involved in the Vail asset transfer scheme. Hargrove was named as an unindicted co-conspirator in exchange for cooperation. Chu, the 3rd board member, received a separate referral to the Connecticut Attorney General's office for state-level securities violations. Isabella heard about the indictment from her lead attorney at 7 in the morning. She called Grayson immediately. "It's done," she said. Not triumphant, more like someone setting down something they've been carrying for a long time and finding the absence of the weight strange. The indictment came through? This morning, Southern District. A pause. Securities fraud. The conspiracy charge covers the offshore layer, which Marcus had mapped completely by April. She paused again. "I've been preparing for this for months. I knew it was coming. She stopped. "What?" "I thought I'd feel differently," she said. "I thought I'd feel..." She searched for the word. "Vindicated, maybe. Or finished." Another pause. "Mostly I just feel tired." He was quiet for a moment. "That's how the right kind of finished usually feels." She was quiet on the line. He could hear her in the New Haven apartment, the sound of the city outside her window. "The governance resolution was completed last week," she said. "My full authority is restored. The new board configuration is in place. I have real independent directors this time, people I actually vetted. The company is..." She paused. "The company is mine again. Really mine. Maybe for the first time." "How does that feel?" A long pause. "Like work," she said. "Good work. But work." She paused. "I know what I want to do with it now, with the company. There are things I let get pushed aside because Victor wanted them pushed aside. An accessibility initiative I'd been developing before the accident, a community technology program that my CFO kept defunding because the ROI wasn't direct." She paused. "I know what I want to build now, and I know why. That's different from before. Everything is different from before." A quiet moment. "Dr. Ellison thinks I can try unassisted walking in controlled conditions next week. She's still being careful about the language, but..." Isabella stopped. She said the word remarkable. For Nora, that's extraordinary. That's what I said. A pause, and underneath it something that was barely there but that he'd learned to catch. The lightest version of a laugh. "Grayson." "Yeah. I want to come home this weekend." She said it simply, without performing what she meant by home, which was part of what made it land the way it did. If Sophie doesn't have anything." "Sophie doesn't have anything." He paused. "She never has anything she wouldn't cancel for you." A silence that had a particular quality to it. "I'll be there Saturday," Isabella said. "Paul." She arrived Saturday afternoon. Sophie was in the backyard when she heard the car and came running through the house and pulled the front door open before Isabella was fully up the ramp Grayson had built in February, a simple wooden thing he'd put in over a weekend without mentioning it until it was done. Sophie stood on the porch and looked at Isabella coming up the ramp in her chair, and then she stepped down and hugged her, which was something Sophie didn't do casually. She was not generally a casual hugger. She made contact deliberately and only when she meant it, and she meant it now completely. Isabella hugged her back with both arms and said nothing for a moment, which was also right. Grayson stayed in the doorway. He watched his daughter and this woman on his front porch, the June light coming through the trees, the yard showing the first real green of the season,
The rose bushes he'd planted along the fence 2 years ago and nearly killed with neglect were putting out new growth. He'd noticed it that morning and felt something about it that he hadn't quite named. Eventually, Sophie let go and stepped back and looked at Isabella with the frank assessment. "You look better," Sophie announced. "I am better. Dr. Ellison says remarkable." "She did say that." Isabella glanced up at Grayson. "I told you she'd find out." "I didn't tell her," he said. "She figured it out." "I always figure things out," Sophie said, without pride, just as a logistical reality. "Are you staying this time? For a while?" Isabella looked at her. Then she looked at Grayson, and her face was the most open he'd ever seen it, open and uncertain in the specific way of someone who wants something real enough that asking for it feels dangerous. "That depends," she said. "On what?" Sophie said. "On whether I'm invited." Sophie looked at her for a moment with the expression she deployed when she found a question confusing in a fundamental way. "You live here," Sophie said. Isabella blinked. "I mean, you basically live here," Sophie said. "You have a drawer, you have a coffee mug that's yours. There's a specific spot at the table that's yours." She tilted her head. "You live here." Isabella looked at Grayson. He looked back at her. He spread his hand slightly. "There it is." "Okay," Isabella said, quietly. "Okay," Sophie agreed. "Good." And she turned and went back inside, the door swinging behind her, and the afternoon held them both in the particular light of a Saturday in June, warm and unscheduled and entirely without agenda for the first time in months. "She's not wrong," Grayson said. "She's never wrong," Isabella said. "That's a little much." "Not really." She looked at the yard, at the roses putting out their new growth along the fence. At the flat afternoon light on the garden, he'd been slowly building back from neglect. At the house with its imperfect roof line and its creaking mudroom floor, and the kitchen where she'd spent a winter making decisions that had cost her something and given back more. "Not in this case." He came down the porch steps and stood beside her chair in the afternoon light. They looked at the yard together. Neither of them said anything else for a while, and nothing needed to be said, and the summer was just starting, and the worst of it was behind them, and whatever came next was coming on their own terms. That, for now, was everything. The summer moved differently than any summer Grayson could remember. Not because it was easier, it wasn't, particularly. The Stanford project ran 2 weeks over schedule, and he spent 3 consecutive Saturdays on site in July doing the kind of problem solving that construction always produced, the kind where the problem is never what it looks like on the surface, and the solution always costs more than the estimate. Isabella was back at Vail Technologies 4 days a week, which meant the apartment in New Haven on the nights when the drive didn't make sense, which meant the house in Greenwich had a rhythm of presences and absences that Sophie adapted to with the fluid practicality of a child who had decided how things were and was simply living inside that decision. But the summer felt different in the way that things feel different when you've stopped bracing for them. Grayson had been bracing for something for 3 years without fully knowing it. The specific posture of a person who has been hit hard and recovered and lives in the permanent low-level expectation of the next thing. You make it functional. You make it look like competence, like forward motion, like a man doing well under the circumstances. And then one day the bracing starts to ease, and you notice it only because of the absence, the unfamiliar lack of tension in a place you'd stopped registering as tense. He noticed it on an ordinary Wednesday in late July. He was in the kitchen making coffee at 6:30, and Isabella was at the table already, which was the normal order of things on the days she was in Greenwich, and Sophie was still upstairs, which was the normal order of things always. And the house was making its usual sounds, the furnace cycling off, the third step creaking as the house adjusted to the morning. And he looked at the kitchen and thought, this is just my life now. Not the old version with the shape of something missing. This version, with all its complications and schedules and imperfect negotiations, all 3 of them moving around each other in the way of people who have learned each other's edges. He didn't say anything about it. He made the coffee. But Dr. Ellison had been right about the word remarkable. In the second week of August, on a Tuesday morning, Isabella Vail walked across a room without holding on to anything. It was the Rehabilitation Center's main practice space,
A large room with cushioned floors and equipment Grayson didn't know the names of, and morning light coming through high windows. Dr. Ellison was there. A physical therapist named Carl, who had been working with Isabella twice a week since April, was there. Grayson was there because Isabella had asked him to be, in a text message at 11 the previous night that said, "Ellison thinks tomorrow might be the day. You don't have to come. But if you wanted to." He'd driven to New Haven at 6 in the morning and waited in the hall until Carl came out and said they were ready. Isabella was standing at one end of the practice space with the particular stillness of someone gathering something internal before an action. She had a small cane, one of those forearm cuffs that allows partial weight distribution, held in her left hand, not because she needed to lean on it, but because Dr. Ellison wanted it there as a confidence measure, something to reach for if the balance shifted. The distance to the other end of the room was perhaps 20 feet. She looked up when Grayson came in. He went to the side of the room and stood against the wall and said nothing. She looked back at the floor in front of her. Then she walked. It wasn't the walk of a person who had never had difficulty walking. It was slow and deliberate, and her right leg moved with a slight asymmetry that was probably permanent, and she was concentrating with an intensity that was visible in her whole body. But she was walking. 20 feet across a room without holding on to anything, the cane in her hand but not bearing her weight, just present, just there. She reached the other side and stopped. Dr. Ellison made a note on her tablet. Carl said nice in the understated way he said everything, which from Carl was roughly equivalent to extraordinary. Isabella stood at the other side of the room. Her back was to Grayson for a moment. He watched her shoulders move with the deeper breath she was taking in, the breath that follows something you've been working toward for a long time. Then she turned around. Her face was not what he expected. He'd expected. He wasn't sure what he'd expected. Triumph, maybe, or the particular release of tears that follows a long effort. What he saw was something quieter and more complicated than either. It was the face of someone who has just received confirmation of something they were afraid to believe. She looked at him from across the room. He pushed off the wall and walked to her, and when he reached her, he put his arms around her and she let him, her face against his shoulder, and neither of them said anything. He felt her breathe, one breath, two, the kind of deliberate breathing that is also a different kind of work. 20 feet, she said into his shoulder. Yeah, it's not a marathon. It's 20 feet you weren't sure you'd get back. She was quiet for a moment, then more than 20 feet. He understood what she meant. He held on for another moment, and she let him, and Dr. Ellison and Carl found reasons to be occupied with other things across the room, which was the professional grace of people who had seen this before and knew when to look away. Sophie found out the way Sophie always found out things, by being more attentive than the adults around her gave her credit for. She was in the car with Grayson on the way back from a friend's house that evening when she said, without preamble, "Something happened today. Good something." He glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "Why do you think that?" "Because you have the face." She said it simply. "The face you have when something is actually good and you're trying not to make a big deal out of it." "I have a face for that." "You have a face for everything. You just don't know it." She looked out the window. "Was it Isabella?" He paused. "She walked across a room today, without the chair." Sophie was quiet for a moment. He watched her in the mirror. She was looking at something outside the window, some dark stretch of road, and her face was doing the thing it did when she was feeling something real that she hadn't decided yet what to do with. "How far?" she said. "About 20 feet. Another silence. Then Sophie nodded slowly, still looking out the window. "Good," she said. The word was small and plain and completely meant. He drove. The road went through a stretch of trees that were just starting to turn, the first hints of amber and rust in the August green. The summer was almost over. Sophie started 3rd grade in 3 weeks. She told him that morning she was not looking forward to it, that she preferred summer's loose structure, that school was a series of situations engineered by adults who didn't fully understand the social dynamics they were creating. He told her that was pretty sophisticated analysis for a 9-year-old. She told him she was going to be 9 in November, and that didn't count yet. "Dad," Sophie said. "Yeah." "Are you going to ask Isabella to stay? For real? Like, permanently?" He was quiet for a moment. "What makes you ask that?"
Because you've both been doing that thing where you act like things are normal when they're not normal. She looked at him in the rear view mirror. It's kind of obvious. Is it? To me, it is. She turned back to the window. I think you should just ask her. People keep waiting to make things real, and then the waiting becomes the main thing. She paused. That's what happened with my friend Cora and the class hamster. Everyone waited to officially name it, and then it escaped and they never got to. He blinked. What's the lesson there exactly? Name the hamster, Dad. He looked at the road. Name the hamster, Sophie said again, with the patience of someone explaining something to a person who is capable of understanding it but requires time. He drove the rest of the way home without saying anything else, and Sophie let him, which was one of the things about her that he was most grateful for. She knew when she'd said the thing and when to let it work. Isabella gave her first major keynote address in September. It was the company's annual technology summit, which Vail Technologies had hosted for 8 years, and which had been thrown into uncertainty by everything that had happened since February. The question of whether to hold it at all had been discussed in 3 board meetings and resolved. When Isabella said she wanted to do it, that canceling would signal fragility the company didn't have, and that she had things she wanted to say. The venue was a conference center in Midtown Manhattan. 1,100 people, including clients, press, industry analysts, and the particular category of person who attends these events to assess the health of a company by watching the person at the top. Grayson and Sophie were there, in the 3rd row, which Isabella had arranged through her communications director with the specific instruction that they be seated somewhere they could see clearly, but that the cameras wouldn't naturally find. Grayson wore the suit he'd bought for Kara's cousin's wedding 6 years ago and still fit, mostly. Sophie wore a blue dress that she had lobbied for extensively, and which had a small stain on the collar that she'd tried to address with a damp cloth that morning with mixed results. She was vibrating slightly in her seat with the contained energy of someone experiencing something significant. Is she nervous? Sophie whispered. Probably, Grayson said. She'd never say so. I'd be terrified. I know. There's a lot of people. 1,100, roughly. Sophie looked at the stage. When she comes out, she said, we should clap the loudest. That's the plan. Isabella came out from the left side of the stage. She was using the forearm cane, the small one, the confidence measure that Dr. Ellison had prescribed, and she walked to the center of the stage at her deliberate pace, the slight asymmetry in her right leg visible to anyone who was looking for it and irrelevant to anyone who was paying attention to her face. She was in a charcoal suit, not unlike the one she'd worn to the Boston board meeting, and she stood at the podium and looked out at 1,100 people and let the room settle. Sophie started clapping. She was early. Isabella hadn't spoken yet. The room was still adjusting to her arrival. But Sophie started clapping with the full conviction of someone who had decided this was the moment, and Grayson joined immediately, and the applause caught and spread and the room rose. Isabella stood at the podium and let it happen, and Grayson watched her face from the 3rd row. The slight adjustment in her jaw, the controlled breath, the look of a person accepting something without letting it knock them off balance. The room settled. She began. She didn't talk about the fraud. That was the choice her communications team had debated at length, and that she had resolved alone. She talked about infrastructure, what it meant, why it mattered, why the systems that nobody saw were the systems that everything depended on. She talked about the hospital contracts and what it meant that they ran reliably. She talked about the government agency systems and the logistics networks, and the 10,000 individual things that Vail Technologies maintained that people used without knowing they were using them. And then she said, I've spent a lot of this year learning what holds, not in the company, in general. What holds when everything else is uncertain? She paused. The answer, I've found, is simpler than you'd expect. What holds is what you built carefully, with people you trust for reasons that are actually yours. She looked out at the room. Vail Technologies is going to be fine. The systems are sound. The people are excellent. The mission is clear, and I am more certain of those things today than I have been in 2 years, because I have spent the last several months being very honest with myself about what I know and what I was pretending to know, and the difference turns out to be significant. The room was quiet. The rest of it, she said, is just work. And I'm good at work. It wasn't a rousing conclusion. It wasn't designed to be. But the applause that followed had a different quality than the opening. Not polite, not performative, but the sound of 1,100 people recognizing something true. Grayson put 2 fingers in his mouth and whistled, which was something he'd last done at a Little League game. Sophie looked at him with an expression of surprised approval. I didn't know you could do that, she said. I have hidden depths. Clearly. On the stage, Isabella found them in the 3rd row. He couldn't be certain she could see them clearly through the stage lighting, but she looked in their direction, and something in her face, just briefly, was not the face of the CEO at the podium. It was something else. Something quieter and more private. Something that was just for them. The garden became a project in October. It had started over the summer as a series of small individual efforts. Grayson clearing the overgrowth along the back fence, Sophie deciding the roses needed talking to and conducting one-sided conversations with them on 3 consecutive Saturdays, Isabella spending an afternoon on the back porch with a notebook drawing what she described as a proper layout, which involved more planning than Grayson had thought a backyard warranted. By fall, it had become a shared thing, the 3 of them in it on weekends, working in the particular companionable way of people who have different jobs in the same project. Grayson moved things and dug holes and figured out the drainage problem in the back corner that had been killing the soil for years. Sophie planted bulbs with an intensity that suggested she held personal opinions about where each one belonged. Isabella sat in her chair or stood at the parallel bars they'd installed along the back fence, repurposed from the Rehabilitation Center's equipment, arranged by Dr. Ellison, installed by Grayson on a Saturday in September, and directed operations from a position of absolute certainty about what should go where and why. On a Saturday in late October, Grayson was on his knees in the dirt working on the drainage trench when Sophie came and stood beside him. Isabella's standing without the cane, Sophie said. He looked up. Isabella was at the far end of the garden, standing near the roses, the forearm cane hanging from the fence beside her unused. She was just standing, looking at the roses, the overgrown climbing ones that had come back strong this year, that were dropping their last petals now in the October cold. She wasn't holding on to anything. She was just standing in the garden in the late afternoon light, still and present in the way of someone who is simply occupying a moment rather than managing it. Grayson watched her. He thought about a highway in February, a wheelchair tipped on the shoulder, a woman in a torn wedding dress with her hands flat on the snow. He thought about the distance between that night and this afternoon, and what that distance was made of. Not time exactly, though time was part of it. What it was made of was all the ordinary things. The kitchen mornings, and the late-night legal pads, and the bad pasta, and the Thai food, and the parallel bars, and the 20 feet across a rehabilitation center floor. The school drop-offs, and the lunch notes, and the whale conversation, and the notebook drawing with the 3 figures under the roses. All the unremarkable accumulation of days that turns out, when you look back at it, to have been the whole story. Sophie went back to her bulbs. Grayson went back to the drainage trench. Isabella stood in the garden. The afternoon held all 3 of them in its October light, which was the low gold kind that only happens in that particular season, not warm enough to lie to you about summer, but generous in its own specific way. The roses were almost done. The bulbs Sophie was planning would come up in April. The garden was in the in-between state of something that had been cleared and tended and planted and was now waiting to show what it would become. He proposed on a Thursday. Not because Thursday was significant, not because he'd planned Thursday. He'd had a different plan, a Saturday plan, a version involving the garden in the evening with Sophie conveniently at a friend's house and the roses in some more photogenic state. He'd thought about it for weeks and assembled the components, and then on a Thursday in November he came home from the Stamford site at 6 o'clock and found Isabella and Sophie in the kitchen doing homework together. Sophie's homework, which Isabella had been helping with twice a week in a development Sophie described as very helpful, and Isabella described as, I went to MIT, a 3rd grade math worksheet isn't a challenge. And the kitchen was warm and something was on the stove that Sophie had apparently started under Isabella's direction. And the light was the particular yellow of a November kitchen at 6 in the evening. And Grayson stood in the doorway with his jacket still on and his work bag still over his shoulder, and looked at the two of them at the table and thought, "This is it. This is the whole thing, right here." He put his bag down. He took off his jacket. Isabella looked up. "You're home early." "6 isn't early. Usually you call if it's before 6:30. She looked at his face. Something shifted in hers. "What?" "Marry me," he said. The kitchen went very quiet. Sophie looked up from her worksheet. She looked at Grayson. She looked at Isabella. She set down her pencil. "I don't have a ring right now," Grayson said. "I have one. I ordered one. It's coming next week. I had a whole different plan for this that involved the garden on a Saturday." He stopped. "But I'm standing here looking at you, and I don't want to wait until Saturday." Isabella was looking at him with an expression he couldn't fully read, which had become rarer. He'd gotten good at reading her, at distinguishing the layers. But this one was layered in a way that made him uncertain, and the uncertainty was real, and he stood in the kitchen in his work clothes and let it be real. "You've been thinking about this for a while," she said. Not a question. "Since August, probably. Honestly, maybe longer." He paused. "Sophie told me to name the hamster." A silence. Then Isabella looked at Sophie. "The hamster," Sophie said calmly, "is a metaphor." "I gathered that," Isabella said. "If you wait too long, things escape," Sophie said. "That's the lesson." Isabella looked at her for a moment. Then she looked back at Grayson. Her face was doing several things simultaneously, and she was, for once, not managing it into any particular shape, just letting it happen. And what it looked like was a person who had spent a long time not being certain of being chosen and was now being chosen plainly and without condition and was figuring out how to hold that. "You're not doing this because of the company," she said, "or the situation, or because, Isabella, I need to say it. I know. I need to ask it. I know. Ask." She looked at him. "Is this because of who I am or because of what we are?" He thought about it honestly, which she deserved. "Both," he said, "but mostly the second one. Mostly because every single day with you in it is just, it's better, it's fuller, it makes more sense." He paused. "And because Sophie put it better than I could." Isabella looked at Sophie. "He needs you," Sophie said with the frank simplicity of someone reporting a fact. "And so do I." She paused. "Also, the garden is better with 3 people." Isabella made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a cry, but was in the region of both. She pressed the back of her hand to her mouth for a moment. Her eyes were bright. "You ordered the ring," she said. "It comes Thursday." "You were going to wait until Saturday." "I was." She looked at him. "How long have you known you weren't going to make it to Saturday?" He thought about it. "The second I pulled into the driveway." She looked at him for a long moment, and the kitchen was very quiet, and the something on the stove was starting to need attention, and Sophie was sitting very still in her chair in the way of someone who understood the weight of the moment and was choosing not to disturb it. "Yes," Isabella said. It was a plain word, unadorned, but it landed full. Sophie made a sound of quiet satisfaction and picked up her pencil and went back to her worksheet, which was such a perfect Sophie response to an emotional moment that Grayson almost laughed. "Are you going back to your homework?" he said. "I have 4 more problems," Sophie said. The moment was complete. You both heard the yes. She paused. "The soup is going to boil over." Isabella started laughing, really laughing, not the carefully managed version, not the small private smile at the kitchen table, full laughter, the kind she'd been letting out more often in recent months, but that still felt, every time, like something genuinely given rather than performed. Grayson went to the stove. The soup was fine. He turned down the heat and looked back at the table at Isabella still laughing and Sophie serenely doing math and thought, this is what it is. This is what the whole complicated, lucky, painful, ordinary thing comes down to. A kitchen, a child with homework, a woman saying yes. Watched. The wedding was in April, late April, when the garden had come up exactly the way Sophie had planned it. The bulbs she'd put in on that October Saturday emerging in sequence through March and April. Crocuses first, and then daffodils, and then the tulips she'd arranged in the back corner in colors that she'd described at the time as a considered palette and which Grayson had privately thought was a lot of ambition for a 9-year-old with a trowel. She had been right. She was usually right. The ceremony was outside. Not an estate, not a chapel, not 400 guests. 50 people in the backyard of a house in Greenwich, Connecticut, on a Saturday when the weather gave them the particular gift of a genuinely warm April afternoon. Not promised, never promised in April, but real. Chairs in rows on the grass. The roses that had come back so strongly this year beginning their first blooms. Mrs. Delgado in the front row in a green dress, crying efficiently and without apology. Marcus Webb with his wife, both of them dressed better than the occasion probably required. Dr. Ellison, at Isabella's specific request, in a chair near the end of a row, watching with the contained expression of a woman who doesn't do sentimentality but makes certain practical exceptions. Sophie was the flower girl. She had strong opinions about this role and had communicated them to Grayson in a detailed conversation 3 weeks before the wedding. She did not want to scatter petals in a way that was randomly chaotic. She wanted a deliberate pattern. She had practiced twice. She executed it, on the day, with the focus she brought to everything she decided was worth doing, and when she reached the end of the petal path she had made, she turned and looked at it with a brief nod of professional satisfaction before taking her seat. Isabella came out of the back of the house on the arm of her father, who had arrived the previous evening and spent an hour in the kitchen with Grayson in a conversation that was not easy and was also necessary, and ended with a handshake that meant more than it looked like from the outside. Her mother had cried when she saw Sophie in the garden the day before and had told Isabella privately that she understood more than she had, and Isabella had accepted this without fully closing the distance and without holding it entirely open. Some things resolve completely. Others resolve into something workable and honest, which is a different kind of resolution and in some ways more durable. Isabella walked through the garden on her father's arm, with the small cane, with the deliberate gait that was hers, asymmetric and certain and entirely unashamed. She wore an ivory dress that was nothing like the one she'd worn in February 14 months ago. Not silk organza, not fitted to spectacle. Simple. Clean. The kind of thing that photographs well without having been designed to. Grayson watched her come through the garden. He thought about the night on the highway, about the wheelchair tipped on the gravel shoulder, about the woman who'd said, "I'm fine" with blue lips in a snowstorm, and had meant something very different by fine than what the word usually means. He thought about everything between that night and this afternoon, the long negotiated distance of it, the ordinary days and the extraordinary ones, and the way they were almost impossible to tell apart until you looked back. He thought about Kara, briefly and honestly, about the specific shape of her absence in his life and Sophie's, about whether it was possible to have two great loves in one life, one that ends and one that begins, and carry both without diminishing either. He'd decided, slowly, that it was. He'd decided that the love you carry for someone who is gone and the love you build with someone who is here don't compete. They coexist, and the first one, if you're honest with yourself, teaches you things about the second one that you couldn't have known otherwise. He'd known Isabella was going to be hard to lose before he fully admitted he wanted to keep her. He'd recognized it on some level in the first week, which was why he'd said the mortgage threat didn't scare him with the particular steadiness he'd said it with. It wasn't bravery. It was the clarity of someone who already knew what was at stake. Isabella reached him. Her father placed her hand in Grayson's and stepped back, and they stood in the garden they'd built together in the April light, and the person who officiated said the words that such occasions require, and Grayson and Isabella said the words back. Sophie, in the front row, held a single rose, one of the climbing ones from the back fence, her particular favorite, and watched the whole thing with an expression that was not quite smiling and not quite crying, but was somewhere in the space between, where the most real feelings tend to live. When it was done, when the words were said, and the yes was spoken again, smaller this time and private, just between the two of them, Isabella looked at Grayson the way she'd looked at him across a rehabilitation center room in August, like someone receiving confirmation of something they were afraid to believe. Sophie stood up from her chair. She walked to them with the rose in her hand and presented it to Isabella, who took it, and then Sophie put her arms around both of them at once, which required her to stretch, and they let her, and the three of them stood in the garden as the afternoon opened up around them,
warm and unhurried, and the guests made the sounds that guests make, and Mrs. Delgado cried without apology. Later, after the guests had thinned and the caterers were clearing and the April light had gone from gold to the low amber of early evening, Sophie found a corner of the garden near the roses and sat down with her drawing pad. She drew the three of them. She'd always drawn all three of them. In every picture since the February morning, she'd come downstairs and found a woman in a ruined dress eating eggs at the kitchen table. In this one, they were standing together under the roses, which were blooming in Sophie's version more fully than they were actually blooming yet, because Sophie drew things as they were going to be. She gave them faces that were recognizable and slightly imprecise in the way of children's drawings that capture something true without technical accuracy. At the bottom of the picture, she wrote, in her careful third-grade printing, "My family chose each other." Then she looked at it for a moment and added, "And we're good at it." Isabella found her there 20 minutes later. Grayson was with a group of guests near the far side of the garden, telling a story that made someone laugh loudly, and Isabella had separated from the group with the intention of a moment alone, which she still needed occasionally, the habit of solitude that doesn't fully leave a person even after they've learned to want company. She found Sophie in the corner with the drawing pad. Sophie held up the drawing without being asked. Isabella looked at it for a long time. She thought about a boardroom in Boston in February, the freeze order going through at 10:08, Victor's face as the architecture of what he'd built began its collapse. She thought about 30 years of other people's plans, of waiting rooms and corporate mergers and the long, patient construction of a cage that looked like care. She thought about a highway in a blizzard, which she'd revisited many times in the year since, the particular terror of it, the particular freedom of it, the fact that both things were completely true at once. She thought about the specific things she'd said in the dark living room in February to a man she barely knew, in a sentence that had surprised her by being honest. "I have never once made a decision purely because it was what I wanted." She'd made several since. She sat down on the ground next to Sophie, in the garden, in the last of the April light. Not gracefully. Getting down to the ground was still a negotiation, still a matter of angles and supports, still something she thought about while doing it. She sat, and Sophie shifted to make room without comment. "Can I keep it?" Isabella said. "I made it for you," Sophie said. Isabella looked at the drawing, at the three figures under the blooming roses, at Sophie's note at the bottom. There was a version of her life, not long ago, not theoretical, where she was someone else's asset in a glass and steel tower, managing her condition and her public image and the distance between who she was and who she was allowed to be. Where the word family meant obligation and the word love meant transaction, where she had $4 billion and a company and a man who had picked her for reasons that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with what she owned. She had none of that now. She had the company back, truly back, with its soul intact and its mission clarified in a board she'd actually chosen. She had the settlement from the legal proceedings that had stripped Victor of the assets he'd accumulated through the fraud and returned them to their proper accounting. She had Dr. Ellison's careful optimism and the parallel bars in the backyard and 20 feet that had become 50 feet that had become a walk through a garden. And she had this, a 9-year-old with a drawing pad. A man across the garden making someone laugh. A house in Greenwich with a creaking third step and a kitchen table and a coffee mug that was specifically hers. None of it was what she'd been promised by the people who'd spent 20 years deciding what she should want. All of it was what she'd found on the other side of the night she stopped letting them. That was the thing nobody told you. The thing that couldn't be put in a board presentation or a strategic plan or a contractual framework. That the life you build by accident, from the rubble of the one that collapsed, can turn out to be the right-shaped one. Not because falling apart is good. It isn't. The accident, the recovery, the fraud, the years of managed diminishment, none of that was good. But what you do with the aftermath is yours in a way that the original plan never was. You didn't get to choose the falling. You only get to choose the building back. She had chosen well. She thought she'd keep choosing. "Isabella?" Sophie said. "Yeah." "Are you thinking deep thoughts?" "A few," Sophie nodded. "You do that a lot. It's okay." She paused. "What are they about?" Isabella looked at the drawing in her hands,
at the three figures under the roses, at Sophie's note. About how things turn out, she said. Sometimes. Sophie considered this. Do they turn out how you expect? Never, Isabella said. Almost never. Is that bad? She looked at the garden, at Grayson coming back through the guests toward them, spotted them in the corner, adjusted his path, at the roses in the late light, at the house with its imperfect roofline and its known sounds. No, she said. It's really not. Sophie leaned against her shoulder. Grayson reached them and looked down at the two of them on the ground in the corner of the garden with the drawing pad, and the look on his face was the one he had when something landed in a place he hadn't been defended against. What are you doing down there? He said. Thinking, Sophie said. Isabella is having deep thoughts. About what? About how things turn out, Isabella said. He sat down on the grass next to her, which was its own negotiation with his knees and the angle of the ground, not graceful either, and Isabella held the drawing between them so he could see it, and the three of them sat in the corner of the garden in the last of the April light, the party winding down around them, the roses blooming above. The runaway bride had found her way back, not to anything she'd left, but to something she'd never known to look for. The single father had discovered that a life you'd thought was finished can begin again, not as a replacement, but as a continuation. The same person, accumulated differently, loving with the specific honesty of someone who knows what loss costs, and has decided the risk is still worth it. And the little girl, who had known from the very first kitchen morning what was happening and what it meant and what it needed from all of them, held the rose in her lap and looked at the garden she'd planted in October that had come up exactly right, and felt the specific satisfaction of someone who had understood the shape of something before it was finished, and had done what she could to help it grow. The family they had chosen, the one they were good at,